Bruna, se posicione aí que a gente já vai começar já. Começaremos em 20 segundos. Valeu, galera.
Obrigada, Manu.
Coloca só o nome dos participantes aí que a gente...
Não, agora eu tô
Pode ser em português, né?
as partes, porque aí fica mais fácil para a gente.
Bom dia a todos e a todas.
Good morning, everyone. Please be welcome. We are kicking off the event Dialogues on Sustainable Finance and Green Recovery in Brazil, an initiative of the Brazilian Development Association, ABDE, in partnership with the German Cooperation Agency, GIZ, through its Fibras and Felicity programs and WRI Brasil. I am Bruno Araújo. I am Sustainability and Economy Manager at ABDE, and I'll follow the whole event with you. The event is being broadcasted by ABDE YouTube channel in Portuguese and English. We'll start now, and we should follow until 12:30. The event has an opening table, and it will be split into panels. To start the event, I invite the participants of the opening session. We'll count with the presence of Mrs. Frederic Sabiel, Environmental Affairs Officer of the German Embassy in Brazil, Mr. Carlos Alexandre Pires, Director of the Energy Department of the Secretariat for Energy Planning and Development of the Ministry of Mines and Energy, Mrs. Raquel Breda, General Coordinator of Global Development Institutions of the Secretariat for International Affairs of the Ministry of Economy, Mr. Michael Rosenauer, Director of GIZ Brazil, Mr. Luis Antonio Lindau, Director of the Cities Program of WRI Brazil, and Mr. José Luis Gordon, Executive Secretary of ABDE. Welcome and thank you for your presence. To start our opening table, I pass the floor to Mrs. Frederic Sabiel. Thank you very much, Bruna. My dear Carlos, my dear Raquel, Michael, and Antonio, and José, good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to open the dialogue about sustainable finances and green recovery in Brazil. In 2 weeks, I had a meeting with the chief of an institute which is offering consultancy services. And they want to know more about this impact of their production about this matter. This consultancy is based on a specific methodology and might result in a process of certification for companies. It is a private initiative, and clearly the industry should pay for the service. I asked her, what was the incentive? Why should they spend money in this consultancy if they don't have to? And she said, the most important incentive is the approval of the bank. The banks are requiring more information about the environmental pact and investments. An example that shows to me that the financial sector is already playing a very important role in the feasibility of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement climate. In Brazil, we have to guide investments toward projects that generate social and environmental benefits and at the same time to avoid investments in projects that are causing negative impacts, thus also avoiding financial services. So today, we would like to focus in two aspects. In the first part, we will discuss how the financial institutions for development, DFIs or foment agencies, can incorporate the SDGs, the sustainable objectives, and the Global Agenda 2030 in their governance and management, so that the institutions of the national system may participate in this mobilization in the world and have access to international resources. It is necessary that we improve the methodology. They have to be able to identify which investments are indeed sustainable, which social benefits they will yield, and then we can invest in new technologies. In the second part, we can discuss the relevance of the cities in this context, how sustainable investments in urban infrastructure can contribute for the green economic recovery. We estimate that the opportunities for investments in sustainable infrastructure in Brazil will total more than $600 billion in the next 20 years. And it has potential to create more than 2 million employments. And also, under the global point of view, there are many financial resources from private companies. After all, many investments are economically feasible. Unfortunately, sustainable projects do not develop simply on their own. But as the cities and national governments increase their participation in the global efforts, they also have access to mechanisms of international cooperation, such as technical assistance and access to funding. Ladies and gentlemen, more than 50 years, Brazil and Germany have been connected through a strategic partnership for the sustainable development. This partnership sustains in the engagement of people. Today's event is an action coordinated of two projects implemented by the German Agency of Cooperation, GIZ, the Brazilian Sustainable Finances, FIBRAS, in collaboration with the Ministry of Economics, and the Felicity Project in collaboration with the European Bank of Investments and the Ministry of Mines and Energy. The dialogue is promoted today by the Brazilian Association of Development and WRI Brasil. I'd like to thank very much all of you for your partnership, and I wish you a nice event. Thank you. Thank you, Frederick. I now pass the floor to Carlos Pires from the Ministry of Mines and Energy. Thank you, Bruna. In behalf of the Ministry of Mines and Energy, I greet Mrs. Frederick Sabial, Director of the International Affairs of the German Embassy in Brazil, for your kind words in the opening. What we have seen in the last few years is that they have been facing a major challenge. This is the arrival of a few black swamps in the forecasting and trying to understand how our future will be. It was the pandemics that came in all of a sudden and changed the behavior of all of us, behavior in the economy, in the finances, in the public policies. We also had, at the same time in Brazil, the water energy crisis, which represents a major challenge, especially for the Ministry of Mines and Energy, with regards to guaranteeing a energy safety for our population and for our country. This, in general, was worsened by the recent crisis in Ukraine, and where we can see how much energy safety is important, especially for European countries. Facing these difficulties and these challenges, what we have noticed is more and more a need of provoking a economic recovery as a countermeasure to all of these challenges that we've seen in these last 2 years. And nevertheless, a few other emerging issues. So more and more, we need public investments and private investments. to incorporate the SDGs and to accelerate the investments, not only in infrastructure, low carbon infrastructure, but also to articulate the three levels, federal, municipal, and state, to build a more sustainable future. So today's event, it represents an important step in the partnership Brazil-Germany, which was very much highlighted by Mrs. Frederick Sabiel for more than 50 years of results harvested from this partnership. And recently, last week, I had been in Berlin for the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue, and I could notice how the German government has been facing these situations. I went to Berlin, I saw major transformations, a lot of public works, a lot of urban mobility works, a lot of preparation for the city to become more and more amicable for the use of electrical vehicles, bicycles, in downtown being restrictive to the traffic of combustion engines. This all shows the will of the government towards sustainable development and development of cities and urban centers. So it is with this that I stop my speech, my opening speech, wishing you a very fruitful event, very enriching event, so that we can leave this event better than when we got in. So I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I wish you all a nice day. Thank you, Carlos. I now pass the floor to Raquel Breda from the Ministry of Economics. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to greet our colleagues of this panel, Frederick, Carlos Alexandre, Michael, Luis Antonio, and Gordon. I'd like to thank for the invitation to participate in this dialogue about sustainable finances and green recovery in Brazil. It is very positive and very welcome events such as this, which allow the sharing and the debate over how our financial institutions are incorporating their institutional objectives in their funding policies and also in their practice, the foment of projects that contribute for the development that ally economic growth, social development, and resilience, and not only the effect of climate changes, but also the impact of crises, be them energy crisis, sanitary crisis, economic, financial, or geopolitical. Considering the active role of public banks and of all the other IDFs or DFIs as intermediates whose influence might be quantitative and also qualitative, the attitude of the banks and funding agencies is paramount, and their policies of funding represent a differential in the generation of opportunities for sustainable business in Brazil. I think it is very happy to be able to share, because we follow up how much our financial institutions have advanced in sustainability. But also we know the many difficulties that the public and private sectors have to have access to resources with proper instruments and easier situations to install renewable sources of energy, to convert industrial plants and agricultural facilities for a better energy efficiency and better use of water and other raw materials, and so many other initiatives that contribute both for the reach of the objectives, the SDGs, as well as the Paris Agreement determinations. We follow the efforts of the institutions such as ABDE, such as the creation of the program Production and Sustainable Consumption of ABDE, which support sustainable projects in agriculture, cities, the issuance of sustainable bonds to make feasible environmental projects in Minas Gerais by the BDMG, the launching of the microcredit program from Fomento Paraná, which promotes female entrepreneurship and initiatives such as SEBRAE, Center of Sustainability, which supports and stimulates sustainability in the small business through an improvement of processes, products, and services. It is necessary to share and also to replicate these and other initiatives if we want not only the business and sectors served by these programs, so they can go forward, and also that all Brazilians have access to a financial system that indeed incorporate as a fundamental principle the reach of a sustainable development that is inclusive and resilient. It is necessary to do more, a lot more. I thank you again for the opportunity, and I wish you all an excellent event. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Raquel. We'll follow now with Michael Rosenauer from GIZ.
Muito obrigado. Bom dia a todas
Thank
e
you very
todos
much. Good morning, everyone.
participantes.
All
Fico muito
participants.
feliz em
I'm very
participar na
happy to
abertura do
participate in the
Diálogos
opening
sobre
of
Finanças
this
Sustentáveis
dialogue about
e Recuperação Verde no Brasil.
sustainable
Ao
finances
lado da
and the
Nossa
green
Senhora
recovery
Frederica
in Brazil,
Sabiel, nossa
together with
assessora para
Frederic
assuntos
Sabiel,
do
our
meio ambiente da
Assistant
Embaixada
for
da
Environmental
Alemanha no Brasil,
Affairs in
e de
the
dois
German Embassy in Brazil,
importantes parceiros
and two
políticos da
important
cooperação
political
técnica
partners
entre
of the
Alemanha e
technical
Brasil.
cooperation
A
between Germany
senhora
and
Raquel
Brazil.
Breda, coordenadora
Mrs.
geral
Raquel
das
Breda, General
instituições
Coordinator
globais
of
de
the Global
Desenvolvimento
Institutions
do
of
Ministério da
Development
Economia,
of the Ministry of
que
Economics,
coopera com o
which
projeto
cooperates
Fibras,
with the
Finanças
Fibras project,
Brasileiras
Brazilian Sustainable
Sustentáveis,
Finances,
e o senhor Carlos
and
Alexandre
Mr.
Pires,
Carlos
diretor
Alexandre
do
Pires,
Departamento
Director
de
of the
Desenvolvimento
Department of
Energético do
Energy
Ministério
Development
de Minas e
of the
Energias,
Ministry of
que
Mines and
coopera com o
Energy,
projeto
which cooperates
Felicity.
with the project
Também
Felicity.
dos senhores Luiz
Also,
Antônio Lindau,
Mr. Luiz
diretor do
Antônio
Programa de
Lindau,
Cidades
Director of
Sustentáveis
the
do WRI
program
Brasil,
Sustainable
e
Cities
José
at
Luiz Gordon,
WRI
secretário
Brazil, and
executivo
José
da
Luiz
ABDE,
Gordon, Executive
que
Secretary
tornaram
of
possível a
ABDE, which
realização do
made
evento
possible
de hoje.
this event
Desejo a todos
of
vocês,
today. I wish you
colegas,
all,
palestrantes,
colleagues,
parceiros
speakers,
nacionais e
national
internacionais
and international
participantes do
partners
evento, bom
that
dia.
participate in the event. I
O
wish you a
Brasil e a
good day.
Alemanha contam com
Brazil
uma
and Germany
parceria
have
estratégica para o
strategic
desenvolvimento
partnership for the
sustentável,
sustainable
que já
development
tem, como já ouvimos,
that,
mais de 50
as we heard,
anos.
more than
Mas
50 years.
recentemente tem ocorrido
But recently,
considerável aumento
we've
da
had
compreensão
a considerable
sobre a
increase in the
necessidade de uma
comprehension
transição
over the need of
sustentável,
a sustainable
incluindo o
transition,
objetivo para uma
including the
economia
objective
de
for
baixa
a
emissão de gases de
low
efeito estufa. Nesse
low
sentido, a
GHG
nossa
emission
parceria
economy.
tem se
In
alinhado a
this
tais
regard, our
mudanças
partnership has
e
been in
focado
alignment
cada
with
vez
such
mais no
changes and
tema.
focused more and
A
more in the topic.
transição sustentável
The
passa por
sustainable
processo de
transition goes
inovação
through
bastante
an
intenso.
innovation process that
Como
is
já
quite intense.
mencionado, os
As
compromissos
we said,
estabelecidos no
the
Acordo de
commitments
Paris,
established in the
bem
Paris
alcançar
Agreement,
os ODS, demandará enormes quantias de recursos.
they will demand
O volume
enormous
de
amounts of
investimentos
resources. The volume
necessários
of investments
exige uma
necessary
reordenação das
demands
finanças
a
em
reordination
níveis
of the
mundiais
finances
e
in
o
world
setor
level,
financeiro
and the
tem
financial
papel
sector
crucial nesta
has a
transição
crucial
sustentável.
role in this
O
sustainable
papel das
transition.
instituições
The role of
financeiras
the
de
DFIs,
desenvolvimento, bancos públicos, bancos de
or public
desenvolvimento
banks and
e
development
das
banks,
agências de fomento
and
é
foment
central nesse
agencies is
processo.
central in this process.
São essas as instituições
These
que
are
têm
the
naturalmente
institutions
o
that have
mandato para
naturally
financiar
a
o
mandate
processo de
to
transição
fund
verde
the
sustentável.
green transition
E, na verdade, a maior
process.
parte das
In fact,
IFRS
most of these
brasileiras já tem uma carteira
DFIs in
bastante
Brazil
alinhada
have a
com os
very
ODS.
aligned
Estabelecer as
portfolio with the
condições
SDGs.
estruturais
To establish the
certas para o
structural
setor
conditions
financeiro
that are right for
ajuda
the financial
a
sector
redirecionar
will
os
help
fluxos
to
de capital
redirect the
e a
capital flows
mobilizar
and
investimentos
to
para a
mobilize
transição
investments to
necessária.
this
Engloba
necessary transition.
necessariamente essas
And it
instituições.
encompasses these
Estou muito
institutions.
feliz que, por meio
I'm
dos
very
projetos
happy
Fibras
that
e Felicity,
through the
possamos
Felicity and
trabalhar
Fibras
com
projects, we
vocês.
can work with you.
Em parceria com a
In partnership with
ABDE, o Fibras
ABDE,
está construindo
Fibras
uma
project is
metodologia
building a
para a
methodology
implementação dos
to
ODS nas
implement
instituições
the
financeiras
SDGs
de
in financial
desenvolvimento.
in
O projeto
DFIs.
que hoje
The
apresentamos e
project today we
discutimos no
present
primeiro
and
painel.
discuss in the first panel.
Em seguida, teremos uma
After that,
discussão
we'll have
promovida
a
pelo
discussion
projeto Felicity
promoted by the
em
Felicity
parceria com o
Project
WRI
in partnership
Brasil
with WRI
sobre a
Brazil
relevância das
about
cidades
the
na
relevance
promoção
of
de
the
uma
cities in the
retomada
promotion of a
econômica verde
green economic retake
e como
or
as
recovery.
instituições financeiras
And
e
as
agências de
financial
fomento
institutions
podem
and foment
contribuir
agencies
com a
can contribute
implantação dessa
with the
agenda que
implementation of this
requer
agenda
investimentos
that
em
requires
infraestrutura urbana
investments
com
in
benefícios
urban
sociais e
infrastructures with
ambientais.
social
Estou
environmental
muito
benefits.
feliz em ver que
I
o
am very
tópico do
happy to see
desenvolvimento
that the topic
econômico
of
sustentável,
economic
o
sustainable
qual o
development,
financiamento sustentável é
through
parte
which sustainable
integrante, está
funding
ganhando
is
mais
part,
relevância
is
em
gaining
nossa
more relevance
cooperação
in our
bilateral. O
bilateral
Brasil tem, de
cooperation.
longe, o maior
Brazil
setor
has by
financeiro da
far the
América Latina.
largest financial sector in
Possui
Latin
o mais
America.
avançado setor
It has
financeiro
the most
verde e
advanced
sustentável da
green
região.
financial sector and
Conta
sustainable
com uma
sector of the
rede de
region.
IHDS
It
regionalmente
has
distribuídas,
a
capazes
network
de
of
atuar
DFIs distributed
diretamente
and
nesse
capable
processo,
to
com
operate directly in
conhecimento do
this process
território e das
with the
políticas
knowledge of the
regionais do
territory
país.
and the regional policies
Agradeço à
of the
ABDE
region.
pela
I
parceria
thank
nesse
ABDE
projeto,
for the
e a
partnership in this
Stuart
project,
Redken e a Citavi e
and Sitawi and
WRI
Stuart Red
pelo
Queen
excelente
and
trabalho que
WRI
estão fazendo.
for the excellent
Agradeço
work they are
também
doing.
os panelistas
I
de
also
hoje, em
thank the
especial nosso
panelists of
parceiro
today, in
KfW.
special our
Tenham todos
partner
ótimo
at
evento
WRI.
e muito obrigado.
I wish you a nice event and thank you very much.
Obrigada, Michael. Eu passo a palavra agora para o
Thank
Tony.
you, Michael. Now I'll pass the floor to Tony from WRI Brazil. Good morning. I'm very pleased to be here with all of you in this opening panel in such a relevant event. Cities are in fact the place where our battle against the climate will be won. This statement was by Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN. It shows that cities account for 70% of the global emissions of global carbon emissions related to energy consumption. And in cities themselves, we will see the effects of climate, especially in developing countries such as Brazil. These effects affect in a disproportionate way those that inhabit low-income areas and reflects the great inequality that we see in the occupation of urban areas. We've seen historic liabilities in urban areas, in very vulnerable areas to climate events. These events are increasingly more frequent. This summer has revealed that with a record number of rainfall in Bahia, in Minas Gerais, and now in Rio de Janeiro, which have left a track of destruction and a lot of different victims. There are also problems with public sanitation and public transportation that have become very clear during the pandemic. Carlos, during his opening remarks, mentioned the case of Berlin, which is, just as Barcelona and many other European cities, is advancing quite a lot in the transformation of its public space into a space that can foster a more sustainable urban mobility. In Brazil, we believe that a trajectory where we have low carbon development is fundamental for us to build a more inclusive, prosperous, and resilient country. This has been shown in a study on Brazil, which was launched in 2020 by WRI Brazil, and which identified a great opportunity for us to have green recovery in our economy in this post-COVID era, which is starting now. That's why I mentioned that we are now having an opportunity with this event. Financing urban investments, integrating aspects of mitigation and climate adaptation is one of the major challenges that we have in Brazil. Since 2015, WRI has been studying urban finance, focusing on sustainable infrastructure. We have many different projects and initiatives, such as the Network for Financing Sustainable Infrastructure in Cities, the so-called FIS network, which has the active participation of technicians from important financial institutions and DFIs that are here with us today. The advances that are on our report are very important, and I invite all of you to take a look at our report, which is available on the WRI website. Well, Brazil is capable of promoting greater access to resources from their municipality so that we can have green recovery. We have solid DFIs to support cities, and we can also overcome institutional and regulatory hurdles that today are locking the access to these resources. This is something that we'll be talking about on our second panel, which talks about investments in cities. I'd like to finish by thanking GIZ for the support and the support of ABDE in organizing this event. This is just a call for us to take steps forward towards implementing the SDGs in Brazil and towards promoting green recovery in Brazil, taking into consideration a just climate transition. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. And just to wrap up our opening panel, I'll pass the floor to Luis Gordon from ABD. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to greet Ms. Frederick, Raquel, Carlos, Mr. Michael, and Tony of WRI. I think I can be very brief now. We've had many important opening statements, but especially I'd like to thank GIZ for making it possible for us to hold this event today and fostering this partnership between ABDE and FIBRAS. This partnership has been very rich and has given us very important results. I want to say that the sustainable finance agenda and the green recovery agenda, especially the 2030 agenda, more than ever is a priority to the national development system that ABDE represents, with development banks, development agencies, credit cooperatives, public commercial banks, FINAPI, and others. Today, our sustainable finance agenda and the SDGs are our greatest priority. And within the scope of this agenda and this priority, ABDE launched during the forum that took place on March 15th and 16th, the 2030 plan, which is a document that tried to show a little bit how the national development system can contribute even more towards a more inclusive, sustainable, and innovative development for Brazil. And in this plan, we were able to show a little bit what the National Development Plan system has been doing to support the 2030 agenda. We have an unprecedented diagnostic on this report, maybe unprecedented in the world, showing what the national development systems have been doing here in Brazil towards the SDGs. We are also talking about our priority SDGs. We have SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, SDG 8 about economic growth and employment, SDG 7 about clean and accessible energy, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 10, reduced inequality. The national development system has been supporting this cause, but there is still a lot to be done. There is a large path to be tracked, and I believe that this is the most important agenda for us right now. And on this agenda of rebuilding and rethinking the strategies of the institutions, our partnership between GIZ and the CAF, which is what we'll be discussing during our first panel, is extremely relevant because it will contribute so that our institutions can incorporate in a more robust way the 2030 agenda and the sustainability agenda. We have 7 pilot projects right now, but we aim to double it to 7 in the second half of the year, given how effective this program is, and given also the importance of this program to Brazil. So our goal is to have this program as a milestone to the national development system in a way that it can be expanded and encompassed over 30 institutions in our national development system. As I mentioned, the 2030 ABDE plan that we presented is also an institutional milestone. It's something unprecedented in Brazil. It's a document the document listing 5 major missions based on the SDGs. So we have selected 5 major agendas based on the SDGs in Brazil, so that Brazil can simulate them and focus also on a sustainable approach. And these missions, the first one focuses on bioeconomics, and we have one also focusing on health, on infrastructure, cities, sustainable cities, which will foster a very important and relevant debates that we will have during this discussion, where I will be talking about sustainable cities. As Tony mentioned, there is no way of thinking of social and economic development without talking about sustainable cities, because that's where the creation of employment lies in Brazil. And our last mission focuses on sustainable agribusiness. So ABDE has created this document with a specific focus on the 2030 agenda, and where we show that by strengthening the national development system, we will be able to fulfill the SDGs in Brazil. So now I will finalize on this by thanking all of those that have taken part in this opening panel. I also want to thank all the other speakers that will be here today, and I want to thank the ABDE and the GIZ team for organizing this event, and I wish you all a very fruitful event today. Thank you.
Obrigada, Gordon.
Thank you, Gordon.
Com a participação do Gordon, a gente encerra a mesa de abertura do evento.
Okay, now we're wrapping up the opening panel of our event. Thank you all for your participation today. And I want you to just wait a couple of minutes while we are organizing our next panel, incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals in Development Finance Institutions. We'll be right back.
Olá, bom dia, pessoal. Tudo bem?
Bom dia.
Good morning, everyone.
Bom dia.
How are you all doing today?
I don't know if Malta and Willem can
Malta and Willem,
press the translation button, please, and then you can have it in English.
testing, can you hear me? Testing, translation in English. Testing, testing.
Yes, it works.
English interpretation, yeah? Okay, great.
Oh, I'm gonna switch to Portuguese now. Bom, já estamos todos do painel aqui, vou só
Well, I
confirmar.
have all panelists here today. I just need to confirm if Willem can hear the translation. Willem, can you hear the translation?
Raquel, fiquei com uma dúvida, como é que eu pronuncio o teu sobrenome?
I have a question. What's your last name? How do I pronounce your last name? Is it Bessos? I say Besso. It's up to you. I'm trying to learn the surnames. Yesterday I was practicing Malta's surname.
Gente, acho que o Willem deve estar tentando entrar de novo. Ele estava com um probleminha no som. Ele pediu 2 minutinhos, ele mandou uma mensagem aqui para a gente.
Willem asked us to wait a couple more minutes. He's having some technical issues, apparently.
Bom, eu vou aproveitar que, né, que estamos todos aqui. Ah, o Willem voltou. Hi, Willem.
Willem's back.
Você consegue acompanhar a tradução, Willem? Tá dando certo?
Can you hear the translation now? Yeah?
Yes, I can.
Ok, perfect. Então tá, pessoal, a gente vai, acho que a gente já pode começar antes.
Okay, I think now we can start our panel. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your presence here and talk a little bit about the dynamics of today's panel. I will open the panel, invite all of you. We'll be starting in 5 seconds. Anyway, unfortunately, I don't have time to explain.
Centraliza aí, peraí. Tá. Bom, estamos de volta para dar início ao
We're
primeiro.
back, and now we are going to start the first panel of our event, incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals in development finance institutions. Now I invite our speakers, Marcelo dos Santos, CAA executive in Brazil, Willem Vosmer, partner at Stewart Radqueen, Raquel Besso, coordinator at NINT, Cynthia Becheline, effectiveness manager at the Development Bank of Minas Gerais, Malta Uting, senior consultant in corporate strategy and sustainability at KfW, and Gustavo Ribeiro, project director at GIZ Brazil, who will be the panel's moderator. I will now give the floor to Marcelo dos Santos to open the panel. Thank you, Marcelo. Good morning, Bruna. Good morning to all of those who are watching us today. I'm very pleased to be here representing CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank ABDE and GIZ for coordinating this discussion today. We understand that the SDGs are tools which are very important for us to effectively develop many different themes that we have as part of the 17 SDGs related to our finances and make them more sustainable. The CAF, as a development bank, and as part of its strategy, prioritizes 3 actions. The first one is the green agenda. The second one, which is fostering green economy, and now the economic recovery in our country. And we also focus on the social agenda, equity, and all related topics.
These projects that we have been supporting together with the GIZ and the ABDE aims to align the portfolios of finance institutions to SDGs. So in Brazil, I am responsible for serving finance institutions such as commercial banks and development agencies in states. And what we notice when we evaluate new clients to our institution is that many of them understand what the SDGs are, but they haven't implemented them. Some others have already started implementing them, but do not have a specific methodology. And others have started doing something based on external consultancies, but they still don't have a common methodology or a common field for the institutions to make their implementation and measure their results. So that's our main goal, to tropicalize this SDG methodology for development agencies at the national level and the subnational level here in Brazil. And our objective is to develop a robust methodology. When I talk about tropicalizing it, I mean adapting the characteristics of the SDGs to our country, as it happens in other countries. In Brazil, we still don't have the robust framework that we see abroad. We also want to implement new methodologies, and there are 7 pilots that have already started the implementation phase, and there will be other institutions where this methodology will be implemented, which will make it easier for us to correct our course and adapt our methodology, and then replicate this methodology not only at the national level here in Brazil, but also we can try to implement this methodology in Latin America, in some other countries that share the same characteristics as Brazil for this agenda. So I'd like to thank Gordon once again, who is leading the ABDE and different projects, and thank GIZ. We have been working together with Sebastian for a long time for the implementation of this project, and Fibras as well, which has effectively been supporting this agenda of sustainable finance in Brazil. And we will be hearing also from the consultants of Stuart Red Queen as well, talking about their challenges and the adaptations that we had to make so that we could get to where we are, so that we can have this common field and correct everything that needs to be corrected and advance in our implementation agenda. So once again, I would like to thank you for the invitation. We are an ally, and ABDE and GIZ are important allies of CAF in our agenda, and I wish you all a very fruitful event. And I'll pass the floor back to Bruna so that we can continue our panel. Thank you very much, and have you all a good morning.
Thank you, Marcelo, for your kind words. I now pass the floor to Gustavo Ribeiro, our moderator, who will explain the dynamics of the panel and will conduct this session. Gustavo,
Obrigado, Bruno. É um prazer estar aqui hoje.
Thank you, Bruno.
Então,
it is a pleasure to
uma
be here.
boa explicação
We had
do contexto
a good
da
explanation on the
apresentação do
context
CAF. Hoje, o
of
primeiro painel
CAF.
vai
Today, in the
contar com
first
4
panel,
apresentações.
we'll
A
have
primeira
4
vai ser
presentations.
mostrando
First
como
one will be
foi
showing
desenvolvida essa
how
metodologia do piloto
this
ETS,
methodology
liderado pela ABDE,
was developed, led by ABDE, with support from Fibras and CAF.
seguida, a gente vem
After that,
mostrar como ela foi
we'll show
adaptada para o Brasil,
how it
né,
was
pela
adapted
NIT,
to Brazil.
Raquel Bisso. Em seguida, a gente mostra caso
through
de
Raquel Bisso,
aplicação
and
dessa
then we show a
metodologia
case
com a
in which this
Cíntia
methodology
do
was
BDG.
applied
Por
with
último, a gente fecha
from
mostrando boas
BDMG,
práticas
and we close
internacionais da
showing
gestão
international
DDS,
good practices
incorporação
and
pelo
the
KfW com
DDS by KfW.
Em seguida, a gente vai ter uma
And after
fase de
that,
encerramento, e
we'll
dependendo
have
da
a
dinâmica,
closing,
talvez a gente
and
consiga
depending on
trazer
the
algumas
dynamics, we might be able to
perguntas, mas
bring
vai
a few
depender muito do tempo.
questions. It
Então,
depends very
sem
much on
mais
the time.
delongas, para iniciar
So,
o
without further
painel,
ado,
primeiro
to
painel
start
de hoje, eu
the
gostaria de
first
convidar
panel
o
of
William
today, I'd
Vosler,
like to
sócio
invite
da
William Vosler,
Stuart Red Queen,
associate of
para apresentar
Stuart
como
Red
foi
Queen, to
o
present
conceito e desenhado essa
how
metodologia do
he
EDS
designed
para
this
instituições financeiras de
SDG methodology
desenvolvimento.
for
Por
financial
favor,
institutions.
Volmer.
Please, Volmer, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share my slides with you and take you through a quick overview of what we did, the objectives of our study, of the work we did, and as well as with the insights and that the project delivered or provided us with, and the output that we delivered to ABDE and its members. Here we go. So we were approached by GIZ and ABDE to help them in developing a methodology that integrated SDGs in financial portfolios, or better said, in decision making for financial decision making. So what did we do? First of all, we looked at the international best practices that are there on SDG integration into decision making for financial institutions. And this was for us to understand what are the best practices out there, what do other financial institutions do, and what can we learn from that and hopefully apply to the context of Brazil and the development finance institutions there. Second, we looked at the needs of the members. We looked at what ABDE's members need when it comes to harmonizing SDG practices, when it comes to embedding SDG methodologies into their operations. And last but not least, we, based on both the best practices that we found and the needs that we established among the members, we developed a methodology and a tool for the members of ABDE to move forward in their integration of SDGs in their operational practices. Let me first take a quick look. Let us first have a quick look at the best practices out there, and I think this is an interesting learning that we can get from the market. So we see that there are typically three specific ways of dealing with SDGs into financial operations, or in the internal operations of financial institutions. And we can call them SDG alignment, SDG labeling, and SDG measurement. First of all, and this is, I would say, the least ambitious methodology, we have seen banks that align the impact of their ongoing sustainability practices to the SDGs. So it's practically an assessment of what I already do as a financial institution, primarily looking at the sustainability practices that a bank has. This could be the green financing operations or the corporate responsibility programs, and how these programs contribute to the SDGs and how they align with the SDGs. This is a methodology, and why I say that the least ambitious one is because it's not that much linked to the actual lending activities of a bank. And that is what we see coming back in the second approach. And the second approach we call SDG labeling. SDG labeling is an approach where a bank looks into the economic activities that it finances in portfolio, which are then linked to the positive and negative effects on SDGs. So this is an estimation of the positive and negative interactions between a sector that is being financed and an SDG that is being affected. This is, again, a good approach to start looking into the actual lending activities of a financial institution, but it is still very much a backward-looking, an ex-post approach to looking for interactions. And another limitation of this approach is that SDG labeling labels the effects, but it does not quantify the volume or the quantity of the effects. It doesn't, better said, it doesn't quantify the magnitude of impact that we can make with a loan. And that is exactly what we encounter in SDG measurement. SDG measurement, as the word itself already says, SDG measurement goes into quantifying that magnitude of impact that we can have through lending. So what this approach does, it tracks the outputs and the outcomes of a loan that contribute to the SDGs at a transaction level, but also at a portfolio level. So what is the accumulative effect of a bundle of financial transactions to a particular SDG? And what this then does, this quantifies the incremental change of a loan or a portfolio on the ground caused by this transaction. Well, these are three interesting approaches. I think these are three approaches that are used by many different financial institutions. However, to us, these are still not the approaches that use SDGs truly as a basis for strategic decision making, for truly steering on the SDGs and on the positive effects or positive contributions that you want to make to an SDG. And that's where we see that there is actually a trend, or you can capture and establish a move from, on the bottom left, capturing accidental effects, or better said, what are the contributions, the positive or negative effects that I have on the SDGs that I accidentally achieve, moving all the way towards SDG steering, where I say, well, I am using the SDGs to identify those areas in an economy or in a country where I want to have the most impact. And this is where I match that with financial interventions that can generate that effect in the most efficient way possible. So this is where you see, if you look at the evolvement, the evolution of how SDGs are used in strategic decision making, it starts with aligning current programs with the SDGs. It then goes to labeling your portfolio portfolio transactions on the SDG interactions that they have. It then goes to measuring and quantifying the outputs to the SDG of each transaction and a portfolio as a whole. But then ultimately, we would advise financial institutions to take that next step towards steering capital towards SDG solutions. How can I generate, or how can I have the biggest bang for my buck when it comes to contribution to the SDG agenda, in this case, in Brazil? So what do we do, and how do we feel, what is a methodology that we developed in order to embed SDGs in decision making? Well, first of all, we feel that the SDGs, a list of 17 goals and 169 targets, is way too long to cover all at once as one financial institution, or let alone with one particular transaction. So what we developed was an exercise where we want to help, we support financial institutions to build a focused SDG strategy. And we do that in 4 steps. And the first step is the Sdg Parameter Set. So what are the most relevant SDGs according to the mandate of your organization? And when you are a green fund, you'll probably care more about a particular SDG of life on water, life on land, or climate change than that you would perhaps care about SDG 9 of industry innovation. Whereas when you are a traditional economic development bank, then you'd probably care a lot about SDG 9. Whereas 14, 15, life on land, life on water are still ones where you want to act responsibly. But what you want to be held accountable for is that particular SDG that is closest to your organization's mandate. Then for step 2, we would want to know where you invest and how do your investments in particular sectors, how does that relate to the SDG agenda in the context where you're investing? So if we're investing in Brazil, what are the sectors that you invest in, and how do investments into these sectors, allocating capital to those sectors, how does that contribute to the SDG agenda in Brazil? And how does that, which takes us to step 3, how does that meet the needs, the development needs of the portfolio's local context? And this is where we can see that, for example, investing in certain sectors has different priorities in the Amazonia or in the urban areas of Sao Paulo. There's different societal and different sustainability items that we need to tackle. And you do that by investing in different sectors and through different SDG strategies. So this is where we want to connect your capital allocation to local needs considerations. So you can do good with your capital, but is that actually meeting the needs of the markets where you invest? And that could lead us to a last step, and that is a reflection on SDG prioritization. How can we bring focus to your SDG strategies by, again, looking into what you consider your SDGs that are closest to your mandate, where you feel that your portfolio has the most potential impact, where you feel that your local needs are the biggest then, and then how those could be then reflected in an SDG prioritized or focused agenda. This is an exercise that we developed, and that's an important point to mention, that it's instead of defining for each of the members of ABDE what SDGs mean to them and determining a tool that allows them to punch in a number and then get out a response, or to get out an automatic result. No, we wanted to build, and that's why it's called an exercise. We wanted to build an SDG experience or an SDG workshop for each of the members in order to go through this process of reflection, where you look at what you find important, what is close to your heart, where your capital makes the most impact, where the needs are the greatest, and then how you can prioritize on a strategy. And then as a last slide, we looked at what, talking to the different players in the market, both in Brazil as well as in other places in the world. We looked at what the most important learnings are when it comes to successful SDG strategies for financial institutions. And the one thing that came up every time is dare to prioritize. The SDGs are, let's call them, the biggest to-do list in the world, and you cannot touch on all the SDGs and all the targets at the same time. You're also perhaps not best suited to touch one or the other. So find those SDGs that are closest to your heart and closest to your organization's core competencies. And that will also help you to take 3 very important steps in building a strategy. First of all, it helps you communicate a focused approach. You zoom in into those areas that you find most important. It helps you prioritize and determine what the indicators are that you want to measure success on. So the impact measurement exercise also becomes a lot more easy, simply because you have a focused strategy. So if you tell me what you want to achieve, I can quite easily tell you what you need to measure if that achievement is defined clearly and narrowly. And then last but not least, the SDGs are interconnected. They can never be seen in isolation. So it's important to acknowledge that there are trade-offs between them. The example that I told you before, the SDG number 9, industry innovation versus the SDG on climate change mitigation. These are two SDGs, and these are two contributions to SDGs that very often present a trade-off in a single investment. That is simply something we have to accept, and I would want to urge you to be open to those trade-offs and to manage those trade-offs, well, to discuss these trade-offs at a transaction level, but to manage them at a portfolio level, because it'll probably be virtually impossible to be great on all levels and on all SDGs at the same time. That's it for now. I would leave. I would like to open the floor for any questions, if that is the format that we're in, and if that's not the format, then I would want to give the word to pass the word on to the next panel member. Thank you very much.
Obrigado. As perguntas, se der tempo, nós vamos consolidar no final da discussão, porque hoje a gente tem uma série grande aí de apresentações, painel bastante focado no conteúdo. Mas agradeço muito a apresentação, muito interessante, que não vou fazer um resumo, que não dá tempo, né, mas mostrou algumas mensagens chaves, que é importante as instituições de desenvolvimento priorizarem os ODS, entender que eles são relacionados, e pensar muito qual ODS tem mais sentido para o mandato da organização. Também é interessante destacar o fato de que algumas instituições financeiras têm maior vocação, né? E no caso do sistema de fomento, isso ainda é maior, pois as instituições e agências de desenvolvimento já atuam, né, têm um mandato natural muito aderente ao ODS. Mesmo assim, é essencial priorizar, e depois foi apresentada uma série de estratégias, né? Alinhamento, rotulagem, mensuração orientada,
to measure, label, and align.
Que acho que a gente vai conseguir discutir mais
profundamente,
e para isso eu gostaria de convidar
But for this, I'd like to invite Raquel Besso from
como que essa metodologia
to present how this methodology was designed to be applied in Brazil. Please, Raquel.
Thank you, Gustavo. Good morning, everyone. I think you can all see my screen now. So good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone who is with us here today. My name is Raquel. I am coordinator of NINT. And just to contextualize a little bit, NINT works with consultancy and ESG assessment, and we operated with Citaui between 2013 and 2021. So I just want to verify NINT. We work with impact investments, and NINT will now be working separately.
Sem profissionais, atuando em diferentes bases, né, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo. Então, queria só esclarecer pouco essa questão do nome para não ficar.
Well, I'd like to bring this issue, not to be confused, because you are going to hear this name very many times, NINT. Well, with regards to today's topic, as our speaker said, ABD is engaged with different actors to promote this SDG integration among the financial institutions in Brazil. We have funders in this project, so GIZ, KfW, and CAF. The Red Queen that presented, they are responsible for the technical support of the tool. At NINT, we are responsible for the implementation of a pilot implementation. So we need to assess the portfolios of the banks, apply the tool, analyze this, and to support the translation of this portfolio to within the tool, to make this process to flow better and to ease this process for financial institutions. And we are having now two pilot implementations. First, it happened from February to March. We're closing the initial results. We had the participation of Ensul, BDMG, and Amazon Bank. And now we'll start a new cycle of pilot implementation with BNDES, Christophe, Paraná, And these banks are responsible for sharing information of their portfolio, to participate in the meetings, to clear out any doubts, to be together with NINT in this implementation. Well, it was just presented. The methodology was just presented, so just to retake a little bit and take the hook here. The SRQ elaborated an approach of 4 stages. And we can actually take the first steps for the implementation of these strategies. As he said, this is a tool that allows financial institutions to point which are the most important SDGs for their mandate.
The second step has to do with the allocation and the contribution of the SDGs regarding capital allocation. So which sectors I invest in and how they are related to different SDGs. The third step has to do with local needs. So what are the priority SDGs to that state, region, or municipality in which I work as a financial institution? And based on the results of the 3 first steps, the finance institutions need to prioritize strategically some of the SDGs. So this strategic prioritization is done through a workshop. So we create different tools and methodologies, thinking about how we can apply this in a workshop together with finance institutions. So what is our methodology in practice? Well, we analyze the positive and negative contribution of the portfolios of finance institutions according to the economic sectors that are being financed. So the tool shows as results the SDGs that were selected as being relevant by the DFIs themselves, allowing for internal comparisons and discussions on the first results. So we have created a paper as a basis to identify, based on a list of sectors and subsectors, how they contribute in a negative and positive way towards the SDGs. So based on that, the DFIs use this tool. So the DFIs, they add their data, they input their data, and we give them an output and with outcomes saying what SDGs they're aligned with. What our methodology isn't? Well, the tool does not propose a methodology for tagging the portfolio operations. So it's not a tool in which you're going to input the operations that you have, and the tool is going to tag the SDGs that are aligned, but it's actually a measurement of how you're contributing in a positive or negative way in your portfolio toward the fulfillment of the different SDGs. So it's just a first step for finance institutions to start discussing how their portfolio is going. And based on that, you can create relevant discussions on how you can improve your operations, how you can measure different contributions. So the tool is just a first step. This is an important point. So the tool allows companies to compare relevant SDGs for the mission of the finance institutions and with the local needs. So the main results of the methodology that the tool brings is a comparison between SDGs that are considered relevant to the mission of the company, so what they self-declare, compared to how much they are contributing towards their SDG according to their capital allocation. So am I actually in line with my mission and with the way I am allocating my capital? If I consider this SDG relevant as a company, am I actually contributing to the development of this SDG? During our implementation workshop, we discussed the results with the DFIs. And based on our results and based on the local needs, the different companies see how much they are contributing their portfolio to the development of these SDGs at the local level. So that's an important discussion. Companies need to know if they are allocating capital towards important SDGs for the place where they are. So that's a very important tool because it enables them to know where they are allocating their capital versus what they self-declare as being important for their mission and what is necessary at the local level where I am operating. So that's why this tool is so important.
Now I'm going to talk about a little bit about our process, how NIT started this journey together with the DFIs. So there were 3 finance institutions in the pilot process of this methodology. So we had 3 major steps. First, we asked DFIs to send their portfolios, and we carried out an evaluation and an analysis of this portfolio, which was very important for us to make to compare different sectors and the different credit products of these finance institutions. So this way, we were able to compare their portfolios and the data the tools require as an input. So this has allowed us to take the first step. The second step was to review the local needs. So we created this tool, and we understood that at the national level, there were 5 priority SDGs, but the tool allows us to update these local needs. As we are operating with development finance institutions, and each one operates in a different state or region, in the case of Amazonia, for example, where we have many different states, how do these SDGs are prioritized at different DFIs? We understand that there are some finance institutions that operate on the general level, but some others have specificities. So we needed to review the SDGs, which were considered priority at the local level, taking into consideration national indicators that were listed on the SDG portal that we have in Brazil. So we took a look at what was the most important thing for Minas Gerais, for example, what was the most important thing when we thought about the Amazon. So we had to review the local needs to apply the tool according to the needs of the DFIs. And last, we created an implementation workshop. It took a month for us to get the creation of this workshop. The tool, as I mentioned before, was created and idealized to be used in a workshop together with each of the DFIs. So for us to analyze the different data of the portfolio and the local needs, we facilitated workshops with each one of the DFIs to implement methodologies and discuss with internal areas what the results were. So during this workshop, we focus on the final graphs, what we consider to be important, and we ask them what surprises them, what doesn't surprise them. So our tool has a guideline of questions to be discussed with the DFIs. And this is very important because during these workshops, we were able to discuss with different areas, the financial area, the planning area, so that we knew where each one was regarding the SDGs. Here we have some of the main results that we are consolidating after finishing the pilot implementation with the 3 participating banks. We held 3 workshops with the participation of 45 participants from different financial institutions in different areas. And we noticed that the SDGs which were considered more important were SDG 2, Zero Hunger, and Sustainable Agriculture. We saw that many of these finance institutions have a relevant portfolio focused on agribusiness, and they also have contributed a lot to SDG 8, which is related to the products and credit lines that these finance institutions have to finance as micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So this is very important. This is very relevant. And our tool correlates this finance to micro and small and micro enterprises with SDG 8. And the third SDG that was the most frequently mentioned was SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, which was very much related to the portfolio of finance institutions focused on industry and the public sector. So this is just a general result. We do have specific results for each finance institution. Unfortunately, I won't be able to detail this, but each finance institution is receiving these results and the analysis that we carried out based on the workshops that we held. So now we are in this process of analysis of final results, and we always like to encourage the finance institutions during workshops to advance in the SDG agenda by incorporating both the SDGs and also sustainable finance frameworks. So it's important for them to first understand how they are contributing towards the SDGs and understand about the SDGs as finance institutions. But it's also important to understand that in this universe of sustainable finance, there are a lot of frameworks, and there are also different agendas that the private sector needs to contribute towards to know how the objectives can be implemented. So we are constantly encouraging these DFIs to be looking not only at the SDGs, but also at the European Union taxonomy and also sustainable finance frameworks that are very relevant. We've had some insights in addition to the 3 SDGs that I showed as being the most frequently mentioned as a positive contribution. We've noticed that the DFIs that participated in our pilot projects have different journeys and different levels of maturity regarding the SDGs. So for those that are still incipient and that do not have an internal methodology, this tool represents a way for these institutions to kick off their implementation so they know how far they are from the SDGs that are relevant to the local needs. So it was a way for them to kick off this the incorporation of SDGs into their strategies. So this tool was very important for these institutions that were still starting with the SDGs. But for those institutions that had already had consultancies and that had already been implementing the SDGs, methodology is very important as well for them to reflect on what they have been doing and to analyze also parameters. So all of the material that we're using in the implementation of this methodology can lead to a new round of discussions. So when we think about sustainable finance, when we think about having operations adapted to different taxonomies, we know that discussions need to continue. They can always be updated. So those finance institutions that had been already implementing these methodologies can use our tool and our results to be able to update their internal parameters. And another point that we have noticed during our pilots is that many times there was a contrast in the results regarding what the institutions found relevant and how they were actually contributing towards the SDGs. This happened a lot because some institutions prioritize broader SDGs as being their priority. And when I mean broader, I mean, for example, SDG 1, no poverty, or SDG 10, reducing inequalities. So the methodology ends up using a correspondence, a correlation across subsectors and more thematic SDGs. So for example, SDG 2, where you have zero hunger, this is related to agribusiness. SDG 6, healthcare for all. This is highly related to building infrastructure like hospitals. And the SDG regarding sanitation, this is very much related to waste management. We have SDG 7, energy, and SDG 9. You have many different SDGs that are more thematic, and they ended up being more present in their building of their portfolio than broader SDGs. So for example, if you had a finance institution that focused a lot on SDG 10, they ended up noticing that their contribution in their portfolio was a little bit far from the SDG that they found to be a priority compared to other SDGs. So this was something that we were able to point out to finance institutions. And when these institutions were prioritizing SDGs, they were able to understand where they could actually contribute. So they wanted they were able to see more clearly how their mission was aligned with some specific SDGs. So that was a little bit of what we wanted to share with you today. I'd like to thank ABD once again for their invitation. We will start now another pilot project with other 4 DFIs, and we will have more results at the end. But that's all for now. I want to thank you, and I want to thank all the other participants. And if there are any other questions, I'm available. Now I'll pass the floor to Gustavo.
Muito obrigado, Raquel. Também sem mais delongas, para a gente cumprir o horário, eu queria, depois de mostrar toda, vamos dizer, a trajetória de como essa metodologia foi avaliada para aplicação no caso brasileiro, e essa interessante ferramenta de priorização de ODS, a gente vai agora para o lado das instituições financeiras de desenvolvimento, aprendendo um pouco como que o BDMG conseguiu pôr na prática essa metodologia. Então, convido a Cíntia Benchelain para fazer uma apresentação. Por favor, Cíntia.
So I'll pass the floor to Cynthia Benchelain.
Good morning, everyone. It is an honor to participate in another ABDE event, which will discuss this role of sustainable finances, green recovery in Brazil. I'd like to thank very much ABDE and GIZ for the invitation. And the objective is to present briefly the BDMG experience with all of this previous work of identifying, serving, and measuring an impact from a trade work connected to the SDGs, and more recently, bringing this major opportunity of work developed in partnership with ABDE and the Stuart Red Queen and NINCT. Raquel is working on this in several projects with our bank. In the work of voluntary institutions that took part in this pilot project, I think it is important to revisit all of this work in connection to SDGs. Now, speaking briefly about BDMG, BDMG is a national bank headquartered in Minas Gerais with about 60 years of work. We work with the private sector as well as SMEs, all the way up to municipalities. I don't know if you can hear me or if you can see the screen. It is not on a presentation mode, someone is telling me. Yes, Cynthia, if you could put it on a presentation mode, we can visualize it a little bit better. Let me just go back 1 minute, please. Do you see it in presentation mode? Yeah, it is okay now. Well, I understand that it is okay now, right? Yeah, I can see, Cynthia, in presentation mode. Okay. All right, just speaking briefly about BDMG, we have about 6 billion reais in the portfolio and a very strong presence in the state of Minas Gerais. We have been working with more than 93% in the 853 municipalities of the state of Minas Gerais. Recovering the recent strategy of the bank, we split all this work with the global agenda of sustainable development into 3 main objectives. First, to amplify the sustainable investments, and this is related to including captures towards SDGs and financial movements on the topic, and amplifying sustainable development or investments for this. For example, in the growth of the portfolio of the bank for this. The second objective is related to the topic here, which is connecting BDMG operations with the Agenda 2030. So we want to follow up in the development of methodology to connect operations to SDGs and the whole process of credit in the bank, to create this monitoring and evaluation method. This is one of the most important steps for the bank, and also to take full advantage of this potential of partnerships and technical cooperations and financial innovations, to formalize new partnerships, to share this DNA finances towards impact. And we developed since 2007, when we had the first free bond by the World Bank. We had a major growth in frameworks and issuance of green bonds. And at the end of 2019, we started developing the framework of sustainable bonds for BDMG. This framework certified the whole portfolio of the bank with regards to social and environmental risks, this to favor the SDGs, and it allowed the issuance of a bond in 2020 for this purpose. And this was a process that in which we learned a lot here in the bank with regards to revisiting our portfolio, understanding SDG criteria through the opinions from partners, and we finished with the construction of a framework. When this revisiting of BDMG portfolio, we used the methodology, ex-post methodology, and we assessed financial products, a variety of funding, canals, the size of the benefited institutions, and we came up to a framework, ESG framework, that is split into social and environmental categories. In social categories, we have a very strong connection with SDG number 3, funding towards health, SDG 4 for education, schools and daycare centers, SDG 11 with fundings and investments in the organization of the cities, SDG number 8, as it was said here, there was a lot of connection with the whole part of funding SMEs and to generate employment and generate and maintain employment. SDG 5 related to the gender inclusion. We have a line, credit line only for women controllers of SMEs, and SDG 11. This is a category towards post-disaster economic recovery. Now we had a sanitary emergency, and we had disasters related to the excessive rain here in the state of Minas Gerais. We have the rupture of some dams. So these are financial items needed, necessary for the recovery after these disasters. And in the environmental point of view, we have this connection with SDG 7, energy efficiency and renewable energy, clean transportation, sanitation, with water, sewage, and solid waste issue. SDG number 2 related to sustainable agriculture, that is intelligent, and SDG 11 of waste reduction by the industry. So this framework allows us to understand the bank portfolio, which SDG we contribute with. It was a work that allowed a lot of learning, and we could connect not only the 3 from the 17 SDGs, but also to get into the 169 goals that many times we keep in the first screen of the SDGs, and we don't know which one of them is really the one we're looking for. And I think one important point is also that not only this connection with the SDGs, but also to advance in terms of measuring the impact and to see which impact we deliver in each one of these SDGs. So we advanced not only in the categorization of the SDGs, but we understood what indicators were related to the topic. So you have a framing on sustainability, on renewable energy, on SDG 7. You have types of projects of electricity generation that I should inform how much I am generating with that funding and how much emissions I could avoid releasing in the atmosphere.
Cíntia, desculpa interromper, mas eu acho que a gente está pausado no slide.
We are still in the slide number 3.
Não sei qual slide você estaria agora, mas a gente está vendo o slide.
I don't know which slide you are, but we're seeing slide number 3. Wow, I am way ahead. Thank you for warning me. Maybe I'll try to put the presentation in PDF format, so it works out.
Com certeza.
Okay, for sure. Thank you for warning me, and I apologize.
Não, sem problema. A gente estava
no problem. We actually followed your explanation.
Então, esse foi nosso framework ADS.
So this was our work, and here we've worked not only to categorize the ESG, but to place indicators such as the served population, reduce CO2 emissions, and some of the SDGs of employment generation. We not only calculate how much we invested, but how many jobs were created, the health lines, how many people were benefited. For example, here in renewable energy, the amount of energy was generated and the CO2 emissions that were avoided. And now in this recent stage of the work in partnership with ABDE and with Stuart Red Quinn, we could revisit all of this work, and I think that concomitant with the organization of data according to this methodology. So we recovered the whole BDMG portfolio in these categories. We did an internal work. That was not easy. To prioritize is not easy, but we split the 3 relevant SDGs, SDGs that were just important and SDGs that were less relevant in the view of BDMG, considering the strategy, funding, captured resources, products, and more expressive expenditures, and the needs of the state of Minas Gerais, which were not contemplated in the portfolio. So this was a very difficult work. It is not easy to prioritize, but as Raquel and other people mentioned, it is extremely essential. It is impossible to act in this framework with 17 SDGs without considering this. And these were the most relevant ones: the employment generation, SMEs, municipal infrastructure and economic recovery. SDG 7 is very relevant, renewable energy and energy efficiency. The only relevant SDGs would be sanitation, and also sustainable agriculture and management of natural resources, and the gender issue. And maybe coming to the final point, considering the methodology applied in this pilot project, all of this prioritization process, we had 3 steps. The reconfiguration of the SDGs split into essentials, which were the 3 ones that we prioritized. Generation, maintenance of employment, SDG number 8, and SDG connected to the cities and green economic recovery. Priority SDGs, which are sustainable agriculture and sanitation.
Cíntia, eu vou pedir para só dar uma
Cynthia, I'll
resumidinha,
have to
porque a gente
ask you
está
to
pouquinho.
summarize because we are just a little bit late. Okay, so we had, as Raquel said, the allocation of capital at BDMG is focused on SDG 7, 8, and 11, being that the local needs point towards SDG number 2, 13, which is the climate action, gender, and cities. So this was always very important to see that not always the allocation of capital in the institution is connected to the local needs. And that's why we need to change and revisit the topic and rethink what would be the best strategy. Just to conclude, I know it's difficult to summarize all this work in just 15 minutes, but I think there is this necessary role of the financial institutions to understand that there is one breaking point. We need to work towards a more sustainable economy, but it is also necessary to focus and to guarantee that we can take advantage of the opportunities to build this transition of this new economy. And for this, we need to define institutional goals, prioritize SDGs, which ones are closer to our mandate. And of course, it depends on the institutions, and also to grow in the monitoring and evaluation agenda. With the ESG and SDGs, we have to advance and have to be able to measure the potential benefits and present the impact of our fundings. In terms of culture, I think it is a challenge for us internally. It is to go beyond the follow-up of these fundings. We need to go to the effects of these fundings. Once again, I'd like to thank for the opportunity, in special our colleagues from BDMG, especially Isabella and Daisy, who have been working in this topic for a long time, and also ABD and GIZ, and Fibras, CAF, and Stuart Red Queen. It was a pleasure to work with you, and I apologize for the technical problems in my presentation.
Muito obrigado, Cíntia.
Thank you, Cynthia.
Nenhuma necessidade, agradecemos
no
por
need to
compartilhar as
thank.
experiências do BDMG.
We
E
are
agora,
happy to
depois de ver
share
essa
the
realidade
BDMG
local,
experiences. Now,
como
after
que
looking at this
aplica,
local reality and how you
Banco de
apply
Desenvolvimento Regional,
as a regional
consegue
development bank,
aplicar e priorizar os
and how you're
ODS,
able
a gente
to
agora
apply
vai
and
dar salto
prioritize
aí
your SDGs will now
para práticas internacionais. Então, para
jump
isso, eu
into
gostaria de
international
convidar
practices.
o
And for this, I'd like to invite
KfW,
from
para mostrar
KfW
das
to show
experiências.
a little bit of their experiences.
O Sr. Witting é consultor sênior de estratégia corporativa e sustentabilidade do KfW.
A consultant of sustainability at KfW, and he will bring the best practices or some international practices in this regard. Please, Malte, you have the floor.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning in Brazil from my side. I thank you for the warm welcome, and I thank also Willem for his presentation, because I guess my presentation, I will share my screen in a minute, closely ties into that. But so, can you see the slides now? Okay, yes. So that works. So as I said, I want to thank Willem, because you brought up the topic kind of, or you're illustrating the journey from SDG alignment, SDG labeling to actual kind of steering from the point of view of the SDGs. And that's exactly the point I wanted to make or illustrate with my presentation, because at KfW, we are right now on this journey, kind of coming from SDG mapping activities towards a more kind of group-wide impact measurement and management system. And the group-wide, and I want to say that beforehand, the group-wide here is important because you might know KfW Development Bank or DEG, kind of financing private sector companies in developing countries. But my perspective is kind of taking the whole KfW group, which also has business units working in Germany. And to be honest, the largest part of our bank are active, for example, in Germany, or kind of we also have business units active in venture capital. So the perspective here is, while some of our business units, kind of the development bank, for example, are quite advanced in SDG management, others are not, to be honest. So what the starting point was is that the aim, the strategic aim of the group and also of our former CEO was the KfW as such should become a kind of transformative promotional bank. And what it means is that our primary goal of what KfW does kind of throughout all the business units is the transformation of economy and society to improve the economic, ecological, and social living conditions worldwide. So that is kind of where the whole sustainable finance agenda then, and also our sustainable finance strategy comes into play, because that was the kind of the point in time where we said, well, we have to take care about our SDG contributions of our financings, but also topics like, are we aligned with our financings to the Paris Agreement? What about ESG risk regulations, kind of in the sphere of sustainable finance? So that was kind of the broader picture. But then talking about the SDG contribution of KfW financing, it was really the question, okay, how can we first somehow map, measure, etc., kind of get a first impression of our SDG contribution, but then how could we potentially steer also with the SDG perspective in mind? So that is kind of the journey I want to take you on with me. So the starting point back then in 2019 was kind of our SDG mapping activity for the KfW group. So we established, first and foremost, a group-wide uniform understanding of SDGs. So we took the SDGs, yes, but also, for example, the German sustainability strategy from the German government, the SDG compass for businesses, for example, took all these documents and established kind of a group-wide understanding. What are kind of actually the SDGs? How can we tie into that? And then we developed a mapping activity. So we focus here on the intended contributions of our new annual commitments. So, but kind of all the commitments throughout the bank. And so to speak, and that is important also when I kind of show you later on where we are now. This is a volume-based logic. So here we really looked at, okay, what are our financing activities within a certain financial year? And then you see on the left-hand side the test grid. We test, okay, on what SDGs are kind of certain activities falling. So there is a precondition, of course. We can't map any activity which is on our exclusion list, but then we also can't do the activity, basically. So, for example, co-financing, etc. But then we test, okay, is the certain activity and map, is the certain activity in line with the SDGs? Which is there kind of, can we assume a positive effect on a certain SDG? And that's basically then is the basis for mapping financial streams on certain SDGs. And the data we use for that are kind of on different levels, kind of quite a lot of data points. So we have, for example, on the side of our activities or the activities of the clients and the partners, we know about the sector they're operating in, kind of NACE codes, for example. We also have kind of internal purpose codes so that we know what kind of our client is actually doing with the money. We also have, at least for some business units, something like kind of product categories, development macros for the development bank from the OECD, for example, impact indicators, and so on and so on. So with this databases, basically we're using that to map financial streams to the SDGs. And here you see kind of the result for the financial year 2021. And here also what Willem said, kind of prioritization comes into play, because here on the right side you see the result for the KfW group. The KfW group, I have to say, is kind of largely, or kind of the largest volumes are kind of the domestic business of KfW. So here you see kind of the main contributions are to SDG 11, 13, and energy. 7, because that's kind of what we do in Germany, and kind of the German development priorities, so to speak, kind of resilient cities, renewable energies, and climate action. But if you would look at kind of the same picture for our different business units, you would see different priorities. For example, for the development bank, you would see larger amounts for no poverty, zero hunger, etc., etc. Or for kind of KfW Capital, which is our venture capital branch, there you would see SDG 9 innovation quite high. So that is kind of, there you see that we also have these priorities across the business units. However, as I said, this was only the first step. So now we're on the journey, because here we're talking about volumes, but the question shouldn't be, okay, how much money are we spending for SDG 13, for example, because you also could spend money badly. So the interesting part for us would then to know what is the actual impact of these volumes. So currently we're on the road of introducing a group-wide impact management system. So really to see what happens on the outcome, and ideally on the impact level, and to get data on that. And here, just to show you how we proceeded here, and we're really in the process of doing that, we start there with the kind of KfW-wide, group-wide theory of change. So really looking into what are our activities, what are we financing across all the business units, and how could we kind of build the impact chain from our activities, financing activities, over the partner activities, through actual kind of outputs, outcomes, and impact. And with this kind of exercise, we developed also our kind of impact areas. So what are kind of our focus sectors where we are active in? And then we try to develop impact indicators. So concrete, measurable, quantitative indicators, also aligned with kind of international indicators like IRIS+, for example. And how can we actually measure what we're doing there? And right now we have kind of around about 50 of these indicators, and they will then kind of be used for different reporting purposes, kind of the group-wide impact balance sheet, yes, but also other reporting practices. But we will also potentially use them for steering our activities, kind of aligned with our SDG priorities. So if we zoom in, what we see here is kind of just an example of what I mean. So we have our impact categories, for example. Here it's kind of protection of biodiversity. So there we're talking about ecological impacts mainly, and what we're then looking at and what we kind of trying to measure is, for example, the area in hectares which is protected, or kind of we could also distinguish between if it's a forest area or another area, but also number of people benefiting from these measures, and so on and so on. So these are kind of the concrete indicators we're measuring across the group, so 4 different business units, so that we then have, on the one hand, a harmonized methodology, but then we can also aggregate these figures on a more kind of corporate level. And the idea is kind of, and that's more of an outlook because we're in the process of doing that. The idea is then that if we have all these figures, and it's also kind of an IT topic with a lot of data behind, and I liked in Willem's presentation that also the amount of data was in your slide. If we have all these data, we have kind of, on the one hand, we can use it for different reporting practices, yes, kind of internally and also for the outside. Kind of we have a compressed overview of what our impact actually is, or our contribution to the SDGs. But also we could use that, for example, for the outside world when we talk about the green bond reporting. So KfW is one of the largest issuers of green bonds. And there we can also use the data to improve our reporting practices. But then we also, and that's kind of the outlook for this year and the years beyond, to be honest, we also want to use these figures and these KPIs on the different levels. So from the programs project level, yes, but also kind of the level of the business unit and maybe also the level of the group as such to steer our activities. So to see and to decide what are our kind of priorities. Talking about SDGs, are there certain areas which are utterly interesting for us, and how are we on track in these cases? So this is kind of the idea behind the system, and this kind of shows the trajectory from kind of labeling SDGs impacts, kind of based on volumes and kind of assigning financing activities to SDGs. Then the second step, which we are right into at the moment, is kind of measuring impacts and trying to get quantitative indicators for our SDG impact. And then the third step, kind of prospective step, would be actual kind of management or steering of impact. So I would say that kind of somehow illustrate what we have also had in the presentations before. And with that, I would like to thank you and end my presentation, because then we might also have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you.
Maud, thank you very much for the presentation. Nós temos sim uma pergunta no chat que é direcionada diretamente para o William ou para a Raquel, e a pergunta diz, da Flávia Carvalho. Bom dia a todos. Gostaria de saber se a metodologia, ao fazer a análise dos portfólios, faz correlação dos setores com os ODS ou vai a nível de metas. Então, eu pediria para a Raquel começar respondendo. Se der tempo, a gente pede para o William também fazer alguma contribuição. Então, por favor, Raquel.
So Raquel, you can start, and if there's time, we can add. The tool shows the results at the level of the SDGs, but the difference is that we correlate sectors and economic subsectors and also the positive and negative effects on the SDGs, and we detail this quite a lot. And in the methodology, we can find it at the target level. So that's the material that is sent to the finance institutions participating in the pilot projects. So even though the graph shows the SDGs, the goals, the methodology behind, the underlying methodology can show the positive and negative effects of each sector on specific targets.
Obrigado, Raquel.
Thank you, Raquel. William.
I'm not sure if you could hear the question. So basically, whether the method developed can reach out targets inside the institutions, or it stays at a sectoral level assessment?
Yeah, and well, this depends. So what the methodology does is that it's a scientific methodology, as Raquel already explained, that matches economic activities with SDGs and SDG targets. That means that independent of the financial institution, this matching can take place. If you then add a layer of the specific ambitions of the financial institution, that is possible, but not in the methodology as we have it now. It would then require a specification and an adjustment, which is doable, but that you would put on another layer of matching ambitions and or targets and SDGs. So that is an adjustment. That's the next step of adjustment.
Thank you very much. Mount, Cynthia, would you like to make some closing remarks, Cynthia or Maud, as well, as we are very short on time and we still have another panel to begin? Please first Maud, and then we close with Cynthia.
Yeah, from my side only, it was great to be here and to see how kind of, even if we not talked before, how all these different topics and presentations kind of closely tie in with each other. So that was great, and thank you for having me here.
Muito obrigado. Cynthia, por favor.
Thank you. Cynthia, please. Once again, I'd like to thank you that I think that it's very interesting to see the point of view of the different development finance institutions and tap into the potential of these partnerships and to learn, of course, from international institutions and to learn from Raquel and also from ABDE. For us, of course, this is an interesting learning. And it's amazing to see what's happening also from an international perspective. And it's also a challenge, of course, when we are talking about collaterals and talking about financing. But this is very important for us to monitor the impact of financing on our territory. So once again, thank you very much for the
Muito obrigado, Cynthia. Também aproveito para agradecer a abertura feita pelo Marcelo Santos da CAF, quem apoiou junto com o projeto Fibras essa iniciativa da ABDE. Também agradecer muito o William Bosmer, da Stuart Redpin, por apresentar como foi concebida a conceitualização. Raquel Besso, da NIT, antiga coordenadora da NIT, né, antiga Cital, que mostrou como o percurso para trazer isso para a realidade brasileira. Cynthia Belichelin, a gerência de criatividade do PDNG, que mostrou na prática como que essa metodologia pode trazer resultados e gestão de portfólio aproximando as ODS, e o fechamento pelo Maud Wütting, consultor sênior do KfW sobre estratégia e sustentabilidade. E assim eu fecho esse painel e passo a palavra para a Bruna para seguir com o segundo painel. Muito obrigado a todas e todos e tenham uma excelente manhã.
So that we can continue our session. Thank you all. Thank you, Gustavo. And the other participants of panel 1. Again, I ask everyone to wait a moment while we set up the second and last panel of our event, Dialogue on Financing Sustainable Recovery in Cities. We'll be back soon.
Bom dia, pessoal. Tudo bem?
A gente pode falar, Bruna?
Bom, se não pudermos, acabou de vazar aqui. Eu acho que sim, o YouTube já está com aquele painelzinho fixo, com a tela de transição. Pessoal, assim, só queria mais uma vez agradecer a presença.
I just want to thank you all once again for your participation. Tatiana will be our moderator today. Unfortunately, Gilberto has to leave at 12. So let's make sure we have Gilberto taking part in both rounds. I think this would be good for our panel. I took some notes here, not to forget the round, and I put Roberto as the first one to be
Well, guys, we are back with our second and last panel, whose title is Dialogue about Funding and Sustainable Retaking Cities. We invite Lucas Prince, manager of GIZ present, Luana ABDE, coordinator of funding at WRI Brasil, Camila Maleronca, specialist consultant in urban, and Fabio from Subnational Infrastructure of Secretary of Ministry of Economy, Gilberto Pei, Executive Secretary of the National Front of Mayors, André Schmeili, Superintendent of Planning and Sustainability of the Regional Bank of Development of Extreme South, the RGE, and to moderate the panel, Tatiana Sali, Director of Program in Sustainable Finances at NIT. Tatiana, you have the floor. Hello, good morning. I'd like to thank for the invitation, and first of all, to say it is an honor to be here sharing the screen with you, Bruna. I'd like to thank all participants who are here with me today to talk about cities. But to begin this panel, I will invite Lucas Prince from GIZ to make a brief context of our talk. Lucas, it is a pleasure to see you again. Welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Good to see you again. Likewise.
Obrigado, Tatiana.
Bom dia. From Luxembourg, where I am at the European Investment Bank. Pleasure to be here today with you and witness this really crucial dialogue on the finance for sustainable recovery and also in particular cities. Before we start, let me briefly take a pause for all of us. And I would like for you to consider, how would you feel with silent traffic, clean air, and safe space for children to play outside of your window? Because I think this is the future that we're aiming for all citizens in Brazilian cities. And this, of course, requires investment. I think that's where the potential in cities really lies, and that's what we're addressing today. Together with our partners at ABDE, Fibras, WRI, and also CITA, we Felicity convened this panel today to really unlock this potential for sustainable investment in cities, because our mission in Felicity is to facilitate this interaction between financing institutions and cities, to really take the money and make it available for improving citizens' lives. We already heard it during the panel, the opening panel this morning, that unlocking this potential in cities is very necessary, because cities are where the climate action needs to happen. And it is where we will win the fight against climate change and build a low carbon, resilient, and inclusive future. This is already what we identified with very concrete potentials for green recovery in our study last year. And we'll hear more about that from Luana soon. So we're very aware that this will not be easy, but it is possible, as we can see from Felicity and the results that we produced in the last years. As a joint initiative of the European Investment Bank and GIZ, we already accelerate climate action in cities. In Mexico, in Indonesia, in Ecuador, and in Brazil, we support projects worth more than 300 million euros, which will save almost 2 million tons of CO2 over the next years, which is equivalent to taking 430,000 cars off our streets. So we also trained over 3,300 professionals in preparing such bankable projects and overcoming the barriers that we will discuss about today. In our Brazil, this is to the result that our partner cities, Porto Alegre, Maringá, and Florianópolis region, are so committed and convinced from the projects that we developed together that they will scale these up considerably. For example, with solar roofs across the whole city instead of just on a couple of schools. I firmly believe that together we can achieve more and find a joint way to a sustainable future. For this, we need to address the barriers in our way, some of which we will directly take on today. I warmly welcome all of you and invite you to take the first step together into this future. Let's be creative and practical. So thank you very much, and I wish you a productive session today.
Thank you, Lucas, for your introduction and for giving us a bit to think about cities and how we could make them more pleasurable for everyone and more sustainable. Agora, vamos passar a palavra para a Luana, do WRI, que vai trazer para a gente...
WRI, who will bring us a presentation of the context of dialogues about funding and retainable recovery. Luana, it is a pleasure to see you. Welcome. You have the screen. Thank you, Tatiana. I also would like to thank Lucas for the introduction. As Tatiana said, my role today, my idea is to give the kickoff for the panel that will follow after my speech. I will share my screen with you. I think it is okay now, right? Okay. Well, as we said initially, especially in the opening speeches from Tony and reinforced by Gordon and now mentioned by Lucas, I'd like to start bringing the importance of the cities. So as it was said, there is no way to talk about sustainable development without talking about urban areas, about cities. If I was to define cities with just one word, I would define it as concentration. Cities concentrate people, economic production, the consumption of energy, the emission of GEE or GHG. But that's not only this. Cities also concentrate the main challenges to the development currently that we can mention here: social inequality and inequality of access to opportunities. It is very clear in the data, but it's even more clear in the environment. When we look at the urban environment, besides concentrating these inequalities, we also need a more infrastructure. Cities in Brazil became urban very fast, and they didn't follow up the necessary amount and quality of services to supply the needs of the population. And this ends up being potentialized now in this environment of urban or urgency, climate urgency. And these are the impacts on the climate change. It was already mentioned, but now it gives us the impact in the Rio de Janeiro in this weekend. Cities are being impacted by landslides, heat waves, floodings. And more than 70% of the cities around the world have already felt some of these impacts. And the pandemic also made these challenges more evident. The pandemic brought economic impact, social impacts, and lives that were impacted in the more vulnerable areas, where we have more concentration of low-income population, especially in slums. Despite this concentration of challenges, the urban areas where we concentrate the opportunities for investment on one side to be able to reduce these demands, when these demands are urgent and somehow they have to be addressed, and on the other side, because they concentrate this economic dynamism, including public and private actors that can work on these fundings. On the other side, by directing these fundings towards sustainability issues, there is an opportunity for new climate actions according to the Paris Agreement. This is a main opportunity. There are initiatives from CCR Palais of about $384 billion that came to the urban areas through this fund. So it is a great opportunity. It unites need to the actors on the public and private sector, and also at the same time to unlock investment in urban areas and promote the transition, low carbon transition in a long term and in a short term, to give the opportunity to do this green recovery. But how do we do it? What needs to be done? Gathering the knowledge built by GIZ and other institutions, we summarize it into three main points. The first one is to direct action to urban areas, making packets of green recovery that are not focused only for urban areas, but they're easily accessible by municipalities. We saw the announcement of several actions, punctual actions focused on economic recovery, but none of them endorsed or focused on urban areas. How can we do it? How it should be done ideally? Well, we should look to the green recovery on a short term, but opening to direct this development towards a net zero and sustainable on a long term. But this cannot be done by itself. It has to be done through a systemic look from all actors involved. It is a federal government, state governments and municipalities, financial institutions, and also the private sector. And the focus of this package should be on sustainable infrastructure. On one side, because of the demand that there is in urban areas, and on the other side, by the potential of positive externalities, the multiplying effect that infrastructure has, not only in economic terms, but in social, environmental, and climate terms. There is a study from the World Bank that points that every $1 invested in mid and low income countries bring about $4 in benefit for society. So there is a potential to do this economic recovery and to redirect on a long term the low carbon trajectory. But what are these sectors? There is a GIZ study that will be released that showed these sectors in larger scale in these three aspects, considering this study to the list of low carbon actions in the civil constructions, urban mobility, sanitation, and waste management, energy efficiency, information communication technology, and the adaptation to climate change. And there is a study from WRI launched last year together with the Coalition for Urban Transitions, which made an estimate considered only climate aspect of emission reduction in the first three sectors. In this first three sectors, civil construction, transports, and waste management, we could reduce about 88% the emissions in 2050. If there is an action from all of these sectors coordinated, there will be a major impact on the long term. And the third aspect is the issue of funding. There is no way to do a plan for a green recovery or thinking about implementing it without having ways to fund it. Funding is very important for this to materialize. And when the municipality tries to fund infrastructure projects, they face three main problems. The first one is their payment capacity. Municipalities have three ways to fund: their own resources, credit operations, and partnerships with the private sector to make it feasible. So in these three aspects, payment capacity is crucial for this to happen. In a short term, the pandemic reached each municipality in different ways, but it's important to keep this fiscal capacity of these municipalities or to support them for this investment to be done now in a short term. And at the same time, we need to look at the mid and long-term actions, especially with regards to improving the reinforcement to the income or revenue.
E focados para investimentos em infraestrutura, como os instrumentos de land value capture.
Focused on instruments with contributions for the improvement that generate these directed resources. We cannot forget to make the necessary tax changes. And we also need to look at the spending. So we need to allocate resources for this kind of investment, making sure that we are focusing on inclusion and sustainability. And we need to coordinate plans and programs with different budgetary planning as well. At the same time as we create these projects, this is something that is very well done by the Paraná system that we have here, aligning these three aspects. We also need to think about accessing credit and the ways of bringing finance to these projects. And that's why it's so important for us to have the national development agencies. So it's important for us to adapt and create conditions that are more adapted to making sure that these companies can access credits as well. This is something that has been done to small and medium companies as well.
Para os municípios.
And this is something that can be done also with states and municipalities. At the same time, we cannot forget that institutions, these development finance institutions, are the main channel to connect municipalities to this green funds. So on one hand, these finance institutions, they can help capture funds directly from climate funds or through different international funds that operate in these climate funds, or maybe they can raise funds through different ways so that they can channel these funds to municipalities. And at the same time, they can provide lower costs to municipalities so that they can make these kind of investments. But it's also important for us to improve access to municipalities to these financial institutions. So there is also a problem of asymmetry of information and also long processes of fundraising, which is something that could be worked on to help municipalities. And we can also help states and municipalities be better aligned. So we need to unlock also funds to consortiums.
There is the issue of good projects, of elaboration of good projects in Brazil. We have seen a series of initiatives within the financial institutions or the facilities of projects that come to reinforce and provide technical support for technical projects, but they are punctual or low scale. We need a massive and continuous support for us to create this environment of good projects, so they are possible to capture credits and to use the private sector as well. And thinking in short term, to adapt the projects that are existing, focusing on those sectors indicated as priority for green action in this first moment, until this hefty support materializes. And with this, talking about the why of the cities, these 3 points for green recovery and climate transition in terms of funding in urban areas and municipalities, I go back to Tati, asking and leaving a question for the whole panel to answer and the actors who are present here. How can we advance funding to urban infrastructure and make feasible a fair transition and green recovery? So I now pass the floor to Tati, and I wish you a good dialogue. Thank you, Luana, for your presentation. You brought an excellent context, and you made a provocation with a question that will be in our minds here for us to try to answer. We now will come to the panel, and I'll bring a little bit of the dynamics. We'll have 2 rounds of questions, which I'll ask to the panelists who are with us, Camila, Fábio, Gilberto, and André. These are 2 different moments we'll talk, and I'll leave now. You can think about the questions, because at the end of this panel, we'll open it for the debate with the public, and you will be able to share your questions through the YouTube chat, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible within the time we have available. So to start this panel, I'd like to thank the presence of every one of you. It is an honor to share the screen with you. And to start this debate, I will ask one question based on what Luana brought to us about the challenges of this sustainable recovery in the cities, which is how to steer and prioritize urban investment in these sectors that today we see are sectors that amplify access to employment, reduce emissions, sanitation, mobility. It is a way, we understand this investment, after what Luana said, is a way to make feasible this green recovery that we're trying. So my question is, what are the alternatives available for Brazilian cities to make feasible this green recovery in a short term? And what are the strategies and funding instruments that have been implemented that we could replicate? This is a question I'll leave for the 4, and based on my own head, I made a list of order of answers. Since I have Camila sharing the screen with me, I'll let Camila to start answering this question. Camila, it is a pleasure to have you with us. Please be welcome. Thank you, Tatiana. Good morning, everyone. I thank very much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here with you, discussing this very important subject. And sometimes it is a bit difficult to talk about funding, since everyone is very much interested, or everyone recognizes the lack of resources as a problem. This is a common problem to pretty much every city, but solutions are not exactly common. And Luana introduced very well the difference. When we talk about scale of municipalities, we're talking about their own resources, which are very different among different cities. Access to credit is different, and the capacity to structure projects is also very different. I will start talking about mid and large cities where urban problems manifest in a more aggressive way. But with this, I don't want to minimize or ignore the topic of small and mid municipalities, which of course are part and are suffering with this climate adaptation. Climate adaptation does not choose the size of the municipality. But when we're talking about larger municipalities, they have a larger concentration of people, and the deficit of infrastructure manifests also in a, once again, I don't want to minimize the other problems, but they're more relevant. When we talk about infrastructure deficits, we need to be concrete. We cannot talk this in an abstract way, because if I had to change or to choose two marking characteristics of these Brazilian cities, one is the deficit of infrastructure. Sanitation and mobility would be the two important topics. Sanitation maybe is more delicate because it is a hidden investment. It is an investment that has very little visibility. But we need to talk about inequality. We cannot talk about deficit only. We have cities that are very well served or relatively well served. When we talk about, when we compare internal territories of the city, if we are to separate periphery from downtown, or rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods, we can look and see that this lack of infrastructure varies very much. We cannot simply mention amplification of the investment in key sectors, but where this investment goes to inside the cities is also an important answer, important information. When we talk about investment, we talk also about an opportunity, and that is my expertise, which is the mobilization of resources from the valuing of urban land. This is an issue that is still incipient for most municipalities. This is a topic that when we're to talk about what are the instruments that can mobilize the value of the land to public funding, there are very few municipalities who have been able to mobilize resources using this instrument, land value capture. But we have a few relevant experiences in using these instruments, notably São Paulo, which was able to, in a trajectory that we can discuss when it starts, from the first implementation up to now, we had about 30 years. And nowadays, the city has a flow that varies. 800 million last year, free resources only for investment through one tool. But this is the number might be important, but this is very abstract. This is money that was not recognized before as a public resource. When Luana said, look, there are three options of funding: own resources, credit operations, and partnerships. Many people place land value capture instruments in the third column. And they talk about land value sharing. But I like more to place these instruments in the category of own resources, because they are public resources. They're produced by the urban development, and they can be incorporated by funding. In São Paulo, the comparative data are not very transparent. It's difficult to make this math, but at some point, these resources came, adding the main instruments, they came to about 20% of the capacity of investment in the city. So it varies. This 20% was a year of low investment, but between 5 and 20% is our best estimate of what this type of resource has represented. So I will close right here so that we can relay the word, but I just would like to mention these points. We have to pay attention to these instruments, which were already called alternatives, and they are, in fact, strategic for us to address not only the overcome of the deficits, but also the to overcome the intra-urban concentration as it manifests in the cities. I will stay here. Thank you, Camila. Thank you very much. You brought a lot of ideas, and you answered what could be replicated. I will now pass this question to Fabio. Fabio, good morning. Welcome. If you want me to repeat the question, if not, I give you the screen. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank ABDE, GIZ, and all organizers for the invitation. This is a fundamental agenda you bring to this reflection. Even to contextualize, much of what Tatiana brought are issues that really north other activities we've been pursuing here at the Ministry of Economics. I'd like, in special, to deal about the strategy of funding. In terms, general terms, macro terms, I share a citation attributed to the UN Secretary General. He said that our fight for global sustainability will be either won or lost in the cities. And I think this is the urban forum where part of this locus of sustainability and life quality in terms of distribution will be located. But infrastructure has a fundamental role in this aspect, as well said by Luana previously. And just to share a little bit, this is something we've been working on very strongly in the last years by the Ministry and Secretary of Infrastructure. Just to mention a few actions in a project that was already finished together with IDB and Climate Bonds Initiative. We produced a few studies, a few documents, highlight two of them. One is opportunities for investment in sustainable infrastructure on a municipal level in Brazil, observing the opportunities and the funding mechanisms for infrastructure. And another of these studies is financial modeling of consortium management, opportunities for Brazil to fund subnational infrastructure, looking especially the situation of small municipalities that was mentioned previously. There are enormous challenges for the whole country, in special considering the reality of small municipalities, and seeking cooperative solutions and consortium solutions is one of these ways. Elements brought up by the sanitation landmark bring this perspective of regionalization, to seek blocks, to be able to promote investments in infrastructure and sanitation in small municipalities. I understand that this agenda of investment in infrastructure is fundamental for the resilience of the cities, especially on a long term. There is a topic, in the lack of a more specific term in Portuguese, leapfrog, which is to give a jump, to do right the first time and not to be reinventing the wheel. So some of the initiatives that we consider to be important in this context is to seek better practices, good international practices, as we are having here in this forum, together with international actors, and as much as possible to tropicalize these methods. One of the aspects that were dealt with, and that Luana brought up, was the importance of the origin of projects, the quality of the projects. And due to a happy coincidence, today, in this morning, in another event that we just released the model of 5 dimensions. It is an adaptation of an international methodology developed by the British government called 5 Keys model. Among several issues, or one of these dimensions, is the look to the cost-benefit relationship, to look at it in a social environmental perspective. What are the best projects that will deliver results for the country, for the society, in terms of quality? In the forums I have participated about sustainable finances, I would say that the origin of projects stage is fundamental to reflect over these several relationships and to promote and seek those projects that really are born with the environmental topics and sustainability topics within, understanding that after the investments are made, the chance of changing them is lesser. So the origin and having resources to structure this project is fundamental. Yet in this agenda, in doing a little bit of a spoiler, because there is something that will be released in the next coming weeks from also best international practices, we'll launch the sustainability card of infrastructure, or rank of infrastructure, taking into consideration all SDGs and the Paris Agreement and the goals that were promoted there. The multilateral banks gathered to promote an unfolding of this sustainable agenda of the SDGs for infrastructure. Notably, a good partner is the IDB, and we did an adaptation of this concept to the country. So among the original documents about sustainable infrastructure, they established a set of attributes, 66 attributes, split into 4 dimensions. I'll mention them right now. In the methodology we'll present shortly, these attributes were reduced to 49 for the country. But the important thing in this rank is the capacity to measure and compare the projects in a reasonably simple way in all stages. And once again, focusing on the importance of looking to the model in the origin stage. This rank is able to measure the degree of adequation of this infrastructure both in the preparation of the project stage, in the bidding stage, in the construction, and also in the operation stage. These are attributes that are organized into 4 main blocks or dimensions: an environmental dimension, a social dimension, and institutional. These 3 ones have a very close relationship, a broad concept of ESG or ASG, and a 4th dimension, which is the economic, financial, economic sustainability dimension. So this rank that should be presented shortly seeks to measure and promote the solid look over these several fronts of infrastructure with the sustainability. Fabio, can I ask you to conclude, because we need to go on? Yeah, these were the comments I had to contribute, and to highlight the importance of the structuring and planning projects for the advancement of this agenda. Thank you, Tatiana. Now, I will just mention here in Camila and Fabio's speech, we think about opportunities and how we can use these international practices to be able to bring opportunities for new projects in the cities. But talking about cities, Gilberto, I'll pass the floor to you.
Talk about the different alternatives that we have and what we've been observing. Good morning, Tatiana. Good morning to my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to see all of you here, and thank all of the partner institutions that are here with us: GIZ, WRI, the Ministry of Economy. So that's the first thing I'd like to do, and thank you for the invitation, obviously. In a very brief way, Tatiana, I know we don't have much time, and I know that you all have other commitments to attend to, but in the very short term, what needs to be done? We need to improve and work on our national dialogue. We need to recognize that for credit operations, for investments in cities, obviously, we need to take into consideration the fiscal health of our country, and the municipalities need to have all taxes paid. And how can you do that? Well, you can do that by balancing your revenue and your spending. And how can you do that if the federal government is always imposing new spending for the municipalities? This is something that happens all the time. When we look at National Congress, the votes that they are constantly casting, they are normally voting on very important causes. They are trying to increase, for example, the salary of nurses. And you know that we've been through a pandemic, a very sad pandemic. There were a lot of people that died during this pandemic, and nurses were fundamental in this scenario. But how are we going to increase their salary? How can we do that? There are also other federal laws that require us to spend more money, and the federal government is not giving us this money. Recently, we have been facing a lot of frailties. The federal government has announced an increase in the salary of teachers by 33%. And how are we going to make this adjustment? We know that inflation was 10%, but the revenues haven't increased by this much. So if the fiscal balance is a necessary condition for us to be able to have our credit operations, but since we do not have dialogue with the federal government, and as we see the federal government making the same mistakes over and over again, and it's not something that has just been happening over the last 2 years, it's something that has happened throughout of our history. We see the federal government constantly requiring more of us, but we do not have resources to meet the needs they impose onto us. But we need to change this. And there's currently a constitutional bill that is being discussed in the National Congress. The objective of this bill is to stop this practice that has been going on for a long time, the practice of imposing new expenses on us without showing where the resources are coming from. There is another bill that has been proposed, which is Bill 13. It's very important that this bill be passed. Most small and medium-sized municipalities won't be able to take on new credit operations if this bill is not passed. No matter what we have, if we had good projects, if we had good programs, everything will go down the drain if we do not have this bill passed, because due to this fiscal fluctuation that we have been seeing over the last 2 years, many municipalities have not been able to allocate 25% towards education, which makes it impossible for them to have new credit operations. So currently there is at the National Congress a bill that is being discussed to help us better use our systems at the municipal level. We know that convincing mayors and convincing secretaries to seek resources to this agenda is very important, but it seems to me that this is becoming easier because we've seen that there are many climate changes that are affecting us all the time, leading to a lot of deaths. So I don't think we need to go back to doing what we used to do in the past, convincing mayors of the importance of this agenda. We see that the evidence of the problem is everywhere, showing how important it is for these investments to be made in cities. And last, I want to talk about mid and long-term projects. How can we structure our cities for long-term infrastructure? The first thing is the implementation of a fiscal council. You need to have rules because they are essential for state and municipalities to demand resources, and these rules are normally laid out by the National Treasury in a way that does not foster dialogue. And the National Fiscal Responsibility Law requires also this National Fiscal Council, and unfortunately it's something that has not been implemented so far. Last, I want to call your attention to a very important phenomenon. Mayors in small and mid-sized cities are seeing an increase, a steep increase in population, different from megalopolis, where the population is already stable. But in smaller cities or cities where the population is very small, now they are losing their population. So we need to look at this demographic change that we are witnessing in Brazil so that this is taken into consideration in our fiscal reform. Unfortunately, the fiscal reform is not looking at this fundamental point. Money needs to go where people are going, and people are going to these bigger cities. So these are just my brief remarks, and I hope to have collaborated to your discussion. Thank you, Gilberto, for your remarks. I think we have opportunities and challenges regardless of the size of the city. We still have a saga ahead of us in this green sustainable recovery, which can be a great way for us to bring together all of these agendas at the table so that they can become a positive agenda for the country and the municipalities. Now I will ask Andrea to answer this first question about how we can deal with this sustainable recovery challenge in the short term. Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here. Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the BRDE, I'd like to thank ABDE and GIZ for the invitation. It's an honor for us to be with such distinguished panelists today. We are a development
institution here at BRDE, and we are a partner institution of our municipality. And last year we celebrated our 60th anniversary, and we started working with municipality finance starting in 2016. And since then we have invested almost 1 billion reais in over 100 municipalities, and most of them had less than 5,000 inhabitants. So the challenge that you mentioned, and echoing what Luana said at first and what Gilberto has just mentioned, we need to think about the short term and what we can do in the short term from a financing point of view. So we can make credit available here at BRDE. This is something possible. When it comes to green sustainability, we need to have an incentive for projects to be more sustainable. So the BRDE has been financing many projects related to the creation of cycle paths, urban mobility, linear parks, and also other sustainability related issues. I think that this is a very important focus. Within the bank and other development institutions, there is credit for these sustainable areas. So what Luana raised at first, when she talked about this holistic approach, we also have to take into consideration the participation of finance institutions and how they can be on the ground. And for us to do that, we need to address the deficit in some small municipalities regarding the origin of projects and the creation of projects. Many times we don't have projects that fit into the long-term criteria, which is something very important for them to access resources. On the other hand, we also need to think about fiscal capacity, which was also something mentioned by my colleagues. In the southern region of Brazil, which is where we operate in Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Paraná, and in Mato Grosso do Sul, sometimes the fiscal issue is not necessarily the main problem, but the lack of projects is a problem. And in this context, in BRDE, we are creating a partnership with the IDB, with the NDB Bank, which focuses a lot on the SDGs. But now we have this new partnership with the IDB, and together we are creating a program called Resilient South. And in this program, we will have resources allocated to the municipalities and to mitigate and prevent natural disasters. So many times these projects are not mainstreamed as much as other paving projects, for example, but there are some projects related to dredging, urban mobility that we have been developing and that are very important. In this South Brazilian project, which will be launched in the second half of the year, we are not just talking about resources. As a bank, we are financiers, but we also institutional coordinators to bring solutions. And among the solutions in the context of this project, we need to talk about financing the formulation of the project. So many times we have professionals, and we finance the hiring of new professionals, and the project takes over 20 years. So that's a challenge, obviously. And in line with what Gilberto said, maybe the challenge that we have regarding credit and the partnership with international banks, many times it's a long way for a national institution to take to bring these resources to Brazil and then make these resources available to municipalities. So this depends on the approval of the federal government, and of course it takes a long time. So these are my initial remarks, but all in all, I would like to agree with everyone regarding the challenge that we have when it comes to sustainability. Thank you, André. I will just make some remarks here. We hear a lot of people talking about challenges and opportunities that we face when we're talking about sustainability. We created a partnership with Felicity, which brings some criteria and some activities and ways for municipalities and other entities and financiers to follow and understand how we can have this recovery in the mid and short terms as well, and how we can use these projects in a way to engage the society as a whole in sustainability topics and to have better projects. It's very good to know that you also support the structuring of projects. I think that this is a challenge as well, especially when you're talking about projects aligned with best international practices that seem to be new, but that are not new, but unfortunately have not been taken on by every entity. But as we create partnerships with other entities, we can definitely move forward. Now let's move on to the second round of questions. When we are talking about the long term, I tried to talk about the short term in our first round of questions, but we know that there are some historic hurdles. Everybody talks about historical barriers that we have that keep the municipalities from accessing credit and the private sector. This is something that we have been already discussing for a while now. And resources for to deal with climate issues and to foster the sustainability agenda. You talked about fiscal issues and also how hard it is to access these resources. So what actions could be taken to help us unlock these resources to other urban areas in the long term? How can we really address these challenges? I know that Gilberto has to leave now. So Gilberto, do you want some time now so that you can talk more about this challenge? It talks a little bit about that during your first answer, but if you want to add to what you said before about this challenge and how we can address this challenge so that cities can move towards this green recovery. So Gilberto, you can start.
Será que o Gilberto está me escutando, Gilberto?
Gilberto, can you hear me? Oh, yes, sorry. Your audio was off. Oh, hello, I'm here. Well, I thank you for your kindness, understanding my another commitment. Unfortunately, I have to leave, but I'd like to repeat. It is not enough to have projects. It is not enough to have convincing or credit. We need to have objective conditions to allow the municipalities to operate these investments. And these objective conditions, unfortunately, are depreciating very fast. That's why we insist once again, and we count on the collaboration of everyone here. Fierce militants of this cause that is so important for the cities in Brazil and around the world, so that we can process this negative effects and improve the environment for the execution of these investments in cities, which are so important. I thank you once again for the invitation. Oh, well, I thank you, Gilberto. Thanks for staying a little bit longer with us. Yeah, all right. Well, speaking about the challenge of long term and the barriers we have, I'd like to pass the floor to Fabio, so that you talk a little bit and complement how we can reduce the barriers and guarantee that we reach where we have to reach with this transatlantic in 2050. All right, thank you. I don't know if I mentioned in my previous speech some of these actions, these important actions with this long-term perspective, but on the other hand, I am very attentive to the speeches of Gilberto and everyone else, but there is one aspect that is complicated to think about long-term when you have very short-term problems that will compromise your support. But Gilberto mentioned many important things about the fiscal issues, which is very critical for most municipalities in Brazil. But a very important aspect is when you bring this look over access to the private sector. Our view, and related to what was said before, we need to recognize the limited fiscal capacity of the municipalities and the public sector in Brazil. This has motivated us to look what are the conditions for private investment. It was mentioned that there is the possibility to invest with public resources, credit lines, or through partnerships with the private sector. And I think this is a good opportunity for the country. There has been a wave of movements in concessions and services and public partnerships, private-public partnerships, the so-called PPPs. There are a few publications of statistics. They end up dying still in their appeal because they're not able to overcome some political issues and some capacity issues of their own teams to handle processes like this, especially in this regard. I think it is important to look at the people, to the trainings and the capacity builders, and bring this agenda forward, and to make use of these tools that many times are already developed. In Andre's speech, in between sources, multilateral banks and foment institutions are here. This is the movement that needs to happen in a coordinated and cooperated way, trying to avoid overlapping and try to take advantage of complementarities. This is part of the pact for the sustainable development and due to for the infrastructure issue. So I just wanted to mention tools, as I mentioned before, the 5-dimension models we launched today, this sustainability rank. And there is another element I'd like to mention we developed with GIZ. It is to bring the component of climate change and disasters for within the projects in this analysis of resilience, adapting World Bank methodologies and using this prognostics of climate change for the future. This is what is going to give us some resilience. Unfortunately, we cannot look through the mirror. We have, because the rainfall indexes are not a reference any longer. We see torrential rains and droughts. We need to look at the best information and to make the best decision possible in the present, so that this infrastructure that is being thought out now has their role fulfilled in the future. Okay, Fabio, thank you. I like when we discuss sustainable development and how to reach where we want to reach. And you mentioned partnerships. This is a way to share learning the best practices and to understand the challenges of every one of us. As you talked about partnerships and how we can unlock this agenda through a cooperation, there would be SDG 17. I'd like to call André and I'll leave Camila to finish this panel. I'm sure she's going to bring some interesting things for us. But André, considering this long term, the fact that you've been working with some municipalities, what is the way we can ease this agenda to reach where it has to reach and overcome these barriers that were discussed today? This is a very difficult question, but what we can bring in terms of formation. I'd like to take a hook at what was said by Fabio and Tatiana, is the issue of private funding. Last year, we had, with the Sdg 11, with the sustainable municipalities, BRDE last year funded more than 160 million reais in adherence to this funding. It is a 60 million project for sanitary landfills. These are private institutions that got resources through the evaluation of BRDE. This is an important role of the bank to bring the resource, and not only to deliver it. We have to analyze the project. And speaking of PPP, BRDE is an articulator, and we participate in the structuring of projects. About a month ago, BRDE funded or closed a deal of technical cooperation with the municipality of Porto Alegre for public lighting PPPs. There is a action zone in the support, which is on renewable energy and energy efficiency. The banks, and there is a lot of credit lines, international credit lines, which designate a resource, subsidized resource of long term to this front of renewable energies and energy efficiency. KfW, who participated, there are resources for this, and usually they are internalized through banks such as BRDE, amongst others. From the European Bank of Investments also, photovoltaic panels. So we had a funding in a partnership with the Felicity for the municipality of Porto Alegre, photovoltaic solar panels for public schools. In many areas, it is possible to act in different fronts. If it is not possible but photovoltaic energy is actually catching on. There are resources for this. We are still looking at some projects. And Tatiana, what do we see on a long term? Well, we had now a victory, which is a work, a long work that was done by BRDE and ABDE. It is not a short-term problem, but it limits the funding for the public sector. 45% of the limit. It was actually released about 10 years ago, 10 days ago, which is Law 400-945, which they remove from this limit. Those who know it know that it can be a limiting point. It removes from this limit those external resources you fund for municipalities when there is an agreement of the federation. So this will unlock some long-term issues, but at the same time, I think it is important to debureaucratize or to create a fast track to internalize external resources with the approval of the federation. Today, it has a very long way. There is a why for this, but there is a series of steps that are taken. And for small banks which have no major structures, such as municipalities, to be able to bring external resource, it's important to say, external resource will add to the economy, to the local economy. You're not just taking resource from BNDES and giving it to the municipality. This is from abroad. If it is not the effort of the municipality, this money would not be in Brazil. So it adds to our economy. It is relevant. And if it comes to the municipality where things happen, our former secretary, Tomás Verdes, life happens in the municipality. So if you take external resource that would not be in Brazil, if it was not the effort of the bank, and you place it at the end, which is this case of the World Bank partnership, it will go to the tip point to build projects of urban resilience, natural disasters prevention. It may not be asphalt because it doesn't appear, but it's a long-term resource that is important for the lives of the people who live in the city. That whenever happens a natural disaster, they will be prepared. So speaking on a long term, it is difficult. And that's why we need to place a partnership of all actors. Federal government, state government, works such as ABDE, who has articulated all these institutions, together with partners such as GIZ. And I actually would like to leave this partner. Challenges are there, we are partners, and I hope that we can look towards this. Thank you, André. Camila, talking about partnerships and the challenge of dialogue and how to bring different methods to the same page, I'd like to pass the floor to you so you can talk a little bit about long term. Well, thank you. Well, this is a responsibility to be the last one to speak, but I think there is, well, I can drink from everyone's source right now. Everybody talked about pactuation, because when we talk about long term, we have this possibility of all agreements that are difficult to see in a short and mid term. We can say, well, in a long term, it is easier to come to a consensus. These are things that do not impact necessarily the lives of people. But today, let's make the major agreements for long term. It is very important, but they depend very much on today's action for this pact to be built. And if we're talking about climate issues, it has to do with important alterations in the way society is organized and how the cities are structured. It is not something that we cannot keep just doing more of the same, because and then say, oh, well, we just woke up this morning and we wanted to have a better city in the future, but we don't do anything now. But we're not going to build this pact. So this pact is not only in the ideas, it is on actions also, to be able to get some sort of demonstration or effect that will contribute for this change in a structuring way. It is not easy, and I'll repeat myself. This prepares facing the deficit, which is unequal amongst all cities. But a second point I'd like to make, I know I'm almost a foreigner here, as someone who's speaking about urban perspective and not about the credit operations itself. But on the long term, the national entities need to honor their commitments. This is another important issue, because to ease access to credit, to have good structuring projects so that credit will come where it needs to come is important. But to honor the credit and to be able to transform this into a virtuous cycle is just as important, because otherwise it will be one only round, and one round that only transfers the bill for the future generations. And we'll just increase the problem for those who come after us. So let's go back there and think about what are the funding points, and think about credit as a funding source. Credit is a solution, but the source is how do we pay this later on? It could be a direct investment, but we need to go back to pay this credit. So I'm just I'm talking about their own resources, which are fiscal, that can be different, and having a soft payment scheme. And in the private sector, for us to have this alternative, we need a strong public sector. We need a strong public policy. Otherwise, we don't address the issue. And we'll be talking about funding according to their profitability. This might be a solution in some cases, but we need to have public policies that are strengthened to have this guidance of the private action. And I understand you're talking about, oh, I funded this and I funded that. So we funded private actors, but private actors who are working in public contracts, it's a public funding. It is just as an intermediate. I'm just thinking in an abstract way, so that at the end of the day, who's paying the investment bill is a long-term contract. And once again, we're talking about strategies of funding and not about funding sources. I am preparing for what? Well, for us to save and to be able to talk about fiscal health of the municipalities and how it can be strengthened so that we come to a long term with respect, and not only which investments will be made, but how these investments will be paid for. This goes through the look of how receivable and deliverable are structured, but there is an aspect of strengthening of fiscal capacity of the municipalities, which is the recognition of urban public resources. I'm coming back here because we're talking about the investment that we recognize that has a lot of investment to be unlocked to come to this green recovery in a short term and to face climate issues in a long term. This means what? More investment in cities. Investment generates valorization. There is a man called Ganashup who said this: which investment generates a greater valorization than their cost? The investment in urban space. Valuation, sorry. But why is it so difficult to finance something that will generate more value than the investment itself? This is our dilemma. And this goes through a restructuring of public policies to say, look, we are funding public investments collectively, and the valuing is being taken by very few if we don't have the instruments of mobilization of land value placed in a strong way. This goes through that pact that I mentioned before. This is not hidden science, and this is not obscure. Many municipalities around the world do it in what is so-called exactions. These are the exchanges in urban investments. In large cities in the world were funded this way. The organization process was responsible for this. We didn't do it in Brazil, but we have tools available to do it. And these are in place and we can use it. Just to mention, I'm not talking by myself. While I was listening to you, I remembered, so I'll paraphrase it. Andres Marcos, who was the Bogota mayor twice, and he was also candidate to be president in Colombia. He has this saying, there is no poor municipality, because the soil, the land, is a very important resource for the municipality. There is a poorly managed municipality. So we need to consider that we do have infrastructure problems. And this fiscal situation that generates this fiscal laziness in smaller municipalities. But to change this perspective and to recognize that the funding solution as a source, and when I mentioned 880 million reais per year in São Paulo, and say, well, it did exist, but where did it go to? It went to the pockets of some owners. But this is a resource that can be unlocked and go back to the public benefits. So the idea of going back and thinking, what are the funding sources? We have the fiscal source, collecting in taxes, and we have this opportunity to mobilize the land and think that, look, we have an asset. Yes, an asset. Thank you. We have an asset that shows that this is possible. You invest 1 and you generate 200. Who does not want to invest in things like this? We're very inefficient in bringing back, not recovering 200. I'd never seen this anywhere, but to recover maybe 50 or 10 would be okay. And then we can keep generating this route. I'll stay over here, and I'll thank you once again for the invitation to participate in this panel. Well, I will very briefly think we talk very much about opportunities, and I have to. You have no idea how difficult it is to center in the screen here. We talked about opportunity, and we heard investment. For those who work in the financial market, investment involves return. You don't need to explain this. CAPEX versus OPEX, CAPEX that can return to everyone who's part of the cycle. And I think we had major movements. Fabio brought some actions that were done, but we had debentures, incentivized debentures in the issue of sustainability and Decree 1012/87. We discussed the short, mid, and several other terms. I will leave here with the feeling that cities are an opportunity, and we do have to look at them as a way to recover this green recovery that we seek so much now that society has this agenda of ESG agenda, taking care of all types of analysis for investments and projects. So doing a little bit of my speech, I see many opportunities in which, with integration, infrastructure, and collaboration, we can migrate to where we want to be more low carbon, more inclusive, more sustainable, and the word sustainable as perennial. Let's be perennial as cities. This is a challenge that all of us have to embrace together. With this, we have enough time. I have 2 other questions I want to ask very fast. Please be careful with the time. I'll leave you 2 minutes so that we finish at the right time. One for Fabio, one for André. Fabio, this is for you.
From your perspective, how city consortiums can be formed to access this kind of financing and these opportunities that we are talking about? And what is the role of development banks? We have BRDE today with us. And what's the role of these development banks to deal with this challenge? Fabio, I will pass the floor to you, but I'll ask the question to André as well so that he can think about it. How do you approach the development and the origin of projects in a resilient point of view, from a resilient point of view? So these are the 2 questions that we have here. And André, you will have another question as well, and then we will move on to our final remarks. Great. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for the invitation once again. And I will mention some partnerships that we have in two UNDP projects, one that has been finished and another one that is underway, and they are very much connected to municipal arrangements. The one that has been finished dealt with consortiums. We have carried out a study on consortiums, and as a result, we have proposed an improvement on a consortium act, and the objective is to improve this legislation, including making it easier to finance consortiums and the application of public policies. And we have another project underway, which focuses on solid residue, solid waste. And the objective is to better the provision of services related to solid waste, which is something very important when it comes to sustainability. Another partnership that I'd like to mention together with SEBRAE, because we know that there are very good practices underway, has to do with looking at the regional development. This is a leading project that SEBRAE develops with the objective of having a coordinated action across the municipalities and the local private sector. And I think this is central. We should think about local mechanisms and use a consortium to provide services related to regulation. And we need to think of cooperation mechanisms. And I believe that consortiums are very good instruments in that sense, obviously taking into consideration the improvements that need to be made on the legislation. André, the floor is yours. How to scale up this Resilient South project. This is a pilot project in partnership with the IDB, actually with the World Bank. As I mentioned, the objective is to improve the capacity of municipalities to face natural disasters and extreme climate events. And as part of our project, we also want to focus on the long term, up to 25 years. But how can we expand that? Well, this is a project that will become operational in the second half of this year. And this kind of funding coming from abroad requires the approval of the federal government. So the federal government needs to evaluate the operations so that we as an internal operator can access this foreign investment. And there's a very important issue that needs to be discussed here in the long term. We cannot just ignore this rule of having the approval of the federal government. But how can we get to this approval? We are talking about many different steps that need to be taken, and they take years. So we need to find a way to make these steps faster somehow. I know that this is not something easy, but this will probably make this resource, this fund, more attractive. We don't know of any private banks which are accessing this kind of resources with this purpose. Private banks normally use different ways to access these funds. So we need to try and find these resources more attractive from an operational point of view. And we also need to have some kind of awareness raising, or we need to make it very clear that this resource can be made available on the ground. We need to look at the needs of people on the ground. We need to have these resources for investment in the long term. They will have consequences in the long term because these resources can also avoid natural resources. So we need to make it easier for us to access these resources. And this is very important for us to be able to scale up our projects. This is the first challenge that we have, but at BRDE, we already have some pipelines of what we can do. We believe that there will be a lot of people who will want to access these resources, but I think that that's what we need to do. We need to make it easier for people to access these resources, and it needs to be easier for those who need these funds to access these funds. And many times internal and external issues also need to be taken into consideration. Thank you, Andrea. We are running late, but I will just share with you my final remarks. We talked a lot about the long, the mid, and the short term. There are projects underway. There are ways for us to have the capital flow towards sustainable development. This is a global trend. It's not just me talking. We need to better align best practices, because this way it would be easier for us to organize ourselves, collaborate, and create the paths that we have so that we can be on board with all of the different organizations that are moving towards net zero, green recovery, and inclusive economy. I want to take the opportunity to say that we have a publication available on the GIZ website about how municipalities can address green and sustainable recovery. The report also talked about employment generation, sustainable infrastructure, and what criteria and indicators could be monitored by municipalities so that they can leave their invisibility. We talked a lot about invisible investments, because they are not part of the life of those that are on the ground, but we want to try and make these investments more visible. So there is a publication about green recovery and how we can identify opportunities. This report is in English and Portuguese and can be found on the website. I just want to finish by thanking all of you who are here with me today. I've been learning a lot from each one of you, and more I understand that we need to work on cities. I also want to thank my team and the Felicity team. I want to thank all of those involved in the publication of this report. Gustavo, thank you so much for being here. I know you have been a great partner in the creation of this publication. I hope you all enjoy it, and we are available for any questions and to help you move towards the green recovery of Brazilian cities, which should be our main focus. Bruna, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here with us today. It's been an honor to share the floor with all of the other panelists today, and I'll give the floor back to you for your final remarks. Thank you, Tatiana. Well, mindful of the time, I'll be quick with my closing remarks. On behalf of the organizers of the event, ABDE, GIZ, and WRI Brasil, I'd like to thank our speakers for their presence, who contributed to a high-level debate on two topics of prime importance for sustainable development in Brazil. I also thank those who follow the broadcast on ABDE's YouTube channel. The event will be recorded and available for those who are interested in watching it later or in publicizing this initiative. I hope to count on our speakers and audience in the next initiatives of ABDE and its partners in this webinar. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.